In a dusty Cairo warehouse, in the summer of 1898, a young German chemist named Ludwig Keimer held something impossible in his hands. The clay vessel was small, unremarkable to the untrained eye, just another artifact among thousands that sat forgotten in wooden crates, catalogued with numbers that meant nothing to anyone anymore. But Keimer noticed something the others had missed: the seal, ancient wax, dark as dried blood, pressed with symbols he recognized from temple inscriptions, symbols that warned, symbols that forbade. His fingers trembled as he worked the wax loose, not from cold. Cairo in summer is merciless, but from something else. The weight of time, perhaps, the sense that he was about to disturb something that had remained undisturbed for longer than human memory could properly contain. When the seal finally broke, a smell flooded the room, sharp, bitter, nothing like the musty odor of decay that archaeologists had learned to expect from ancient Egypt. This was different, organic, yes, but somehow wrong, as if the substance inside had been waiting all these centuries to be released. Inside the vessel, a thick residue clung to the clay, dark, almost black, with an oily texture that caught the light in strange ways. Keimer had studied chemistry in Berlin. He knew plants, minerals, common organic compounds. This matched nothing in his experience. He scraped a sample onto glass, held it up to the slanted afternoon light filtering through the warehouse windows. Dust motes danced around his hand, 3,000 years pressed against his fingertips, and he felt the weight of it, the certainty that he was touching something that shouldn't exist in the hands of the living. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his discovery was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, more vessels surfaced from the catalogues, dozens of them, all found in priest quarters, all sealed the same way, all containing substances that defied identification. Some were resinous, others powdered. A few had crystalline structures that seemed to shift in appearance depending on the angle of observation. Every vessel bore warnings in hieroglyphs, carved or painted with deliberate care. Do not open, do not consume, reserved for those who see beyond the veil. Over a century later, with technology Keimer couldn't have imagined, scientists finally analyzed samples from those ancient vessels. What they found should have been impossible. Compounds with molecular structures that don't appear in any known plant. Chemical signatures that suggest processing methods far more sophisticated than anything we've attributed to ancient Egyptian medicine. And most disturbing of all, trace amounts of substances that affect human consciousness in ways modern pharmacology is only beginning to understand. The priests were hiding something they consumed, inhaled, used in rituals that left no written record. Something powerful enough to seal away with sacred warnings. And whatever it was, they made certain it would outlast their civilization, waiting in darkness for hands curious enough, or foolish enough, to break the seal. What were the priests hiding? Ancient Egypt's priests didn't protect their secrets from enemies. They protected them from each other. Historical texts record something remarkable and disturbing. Priests executed not by pharaohs, not by foreign invaders, but by their own temple colleagues. The crime: speaking forbidden knowledge aloud. The method: quiet disappearance. No trial, no public spectacle. Just absence where a person used to be, and a name carefully erased from temple records as if they had never existed. This wasn't political paranoia, it was theological terror. The priests operated within a rigid hierarchy of knowledge that determined not just what you could know, but what you were permitted to survive knowing. At the outermost level, common priests learned public rituals, the ceremonies visible to Egyptian citizens, the prayers spoken in daylight. One tier deeper, senior clergy accessed temple archives, studied astronomical calculations, managed the economic machinery that made temples function as the nerve centers of Egyptian civilization. But beyond those layers existed something else. Knowledge that was never written down, never carved into temple walls, never recorded on papyrus that might survive to be read by unauthorized eyes. This was oral tradition in its most extreme form, information passed from dying priest to chosen successor, in sealed chambers, often in the final hours before death. The transfer happened in darkness, behind walls so thick that no sound could escape. What was said in those rooms died with the speakers, unless they chose to perpetuate it through one more generation. The priests called it Heka, Not magic in the way we understand the word, but sacred power, the force that held reality together, that separated order from chaos, that allowed the universe to continue existing instead of collapsing back into the void from which it came. They believed Heka resided in specific words, precise gestures, and certain substances that could only be handled by those who understood the cosmic weight of what they were touching. To the priests, misusing Heka wasn't a moral crime, it was an existential threat. They genuinely believed that speaking the wrong words or using the wrong substance incorrectly could unravel the fabric of existence itself. This changes everything about how we interpret their secrecy. These weren't charlatans protecting profitable tricks. They weren't power-hungry elites hoarding knowledge for political advantage. They were terrified. Imagine being entrusted with something you believed could destroy the world if mishandled. Imagine knowing that other priests had accidentally unleashed forces they couldn't control, had opened doorways they couldn't close. The substances hidden in those sealed vessels weren't recreational drugs or simple medicines. They were keys, weapons, doorways to states of consciousness. The priests approached the way nuclear physicists approach enriched uranium, with absolute precision, genuine fear, and the knowledge that one mistake could mean catastrophe. The penalty for revealing what happened in the innermost chambers wasn't execution. It was worse, eternal erasure, your name removed from every inscription. Your soul denied existence not just in the afterlife but retroactively, as if you had never been born. So what could possibly be worth that risk to protect? But how do we know what they were hiding if they never wrote it down? They burned the scrolls. They sealed the chambers. They swore oaths of silence that lasted lifetimes. But they forgot one thing: molecules don't keep secrets, and their own bodies became the witnesses they never intended to leave behind. The physical evidence exists because the Egyptians, for all their meticulous control over public records, couldn't control decay. They couldn't prevent residue from staining clay vessels buried in the sand. They couldn't stop botanical remains from surviving in hidden chambers sealed beneath sanctuaries. They couldn't erase the chemical signatures that had already absorbed into their own hair, their bones, their mummified tissue. The priests tried to take their secrets to the grave. They succeeded. But the grave gave them back. Start with the vessels. Dozens recovered from priest living quarters, never from public temple areas where ordinary Egyptians might glimpse them, but from private chambers, storage rooms, spaces reserved for clergy who had already passed through multiple initiations. The residue inside these containers has been subjected to modern chemical analysis. Gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, techniques that can identify molecular structures at microscopic levels. The results don't match anything we'd expect from ordinary temple activities. These aren't traces of incense or offerings or medicines documented in Egyptian medical texts. These are compounds that shouldn't be there. Substances that suggest the priests were consuming, inhaling, or applying something their official duties never required. Then there are the chambers. At Karnak, beneath the sanctuary's oldest foundations, excavators found rooms that don't appear on any temple map. Small spaces deliberately concealed, accessible only through passages that were sealed with stones matching the surrounding architecture so perfectly that they went undetected for millennia. Inside these chambers, botanical remains, seeds from plants that don't grow in Egypt, root fragments from species that would have required trade routes stretching across continents, storage jars still faintly perfumed with substances that make modern chemists reach for protective equipment. Tomb paintings add another layer. In certain private tombs, always belonging to high-ranking priests, we find scenes that don't match standard funerary art. Figures consuming unidentified substances during what appear to be nighttime rituals. Hieroglyphs describing states of consciousness using vocabulary that doesn't appear in temple literature. Images of priests with dilated pupils, bodies in postures suggesting trance or ecstasy, surrounded by symbols associated with the boundary between life and death. But the most damning evidence comes from the priests themselves. Mummified bodies preserved by the very rituals they performed. Hair samples analyzed decades after excavation reveal chemical traces, alkaloids, organic compounds, substances that accumulate in human tissue only through repeated exposure. Their cells recorded what their mouths refused to speak. Toxicology reports on 3,000-year-old tissue show patterns consistent with regular consumption of mind, altering substances in combinations and concentrations that suggest deliberate, systematic use. The Egyptians were meticulous about controlling information. They burned texts they deemed dangerous. They restricted knowledge through hierarchies so rigid that even asking the wrong question could mean death. But they couldn't destroy the evidence written in molecules, preserved in sealed darkness, carried in the fabric of their own bodies. Before we can understand what these priests consumed, we must understand who they were, their training, their daily existence, their relationship with states of consciousness that existed beyond ordinary experience. For decades, the academic world operated under an unspoken rule. Don't mention drugs and ancient Egypt in the same breath. Not because the evidence didn't exist, but because the conversation itself felt dangerous. Scholars worried about projecting modern drug culture onto civilizations that might have had entirely different relationships with altered consciousness. They feared sensationalism. That serious research would be reduced to clickbait headlines about stoned pharaohs and ancient psychedelic cults. And underneath those concerns lay legitimate caution about interpreting ambiguous evidence. Ancient residues degrade. Botanical remains can be contaminated. Tomb paintings require context. The responsible position, many argued, was skeptical restraint. But restraint became willful blindness. As evidence accumulated, chemical analyses, botanical identifications, textual references previously dismissed as metaphorical. The silence grew harder to maintain. Archaeochemists were finding compounds that could be explained as incense or medicine. Ethnobotanists were identifying plant species with known psychoactive properties in contexts that made their presence deliberate, not accidental. Historians studying ritual texts were encountering descriptions of altered states too specific, too physiologically detailed, to be purely symbolic. The dam broke quietly. In 2019, a lab report analyzing residue from temple vessels identified multiple psychoactive alkaloids in combinations suggesting intentional preparation. The researchers published their findings in a peer-reviewed journal, and suddenly scholars who'd been quietly investigating this question for years realized they weren't alone. A counter-movement had been building in the shadows of mainstream Egyptology. Researchers using mass spectrometry to read molecular signatures invisible to previous generations, applying techniques from forensic toxicology to ancient contexts, cross-referencing Egyptian evidence with psychoactive substance use in other ancient cultures where the practice was undeniable. Figures like Andrew Sherratt, who pioneered the study of prehistoric intoxicants, had laid groundwork decades earlier. His work demonstrated that altered consciousness wasn't a modern invention, but a fundamental aspect of human ritual behavior across cultures and millennia. Recent research has built on that foundation, applying technology Sherratt could have imagined. Gas chromatography can now detect compounds in parts per billion. DNA analysis can identify plant species from microscopic fragments. Isotope studies can determine where substances originated, revealing trade networks specifically dedicated to moving psychoactive materials. This isn't conspiracy theory meeting archaeology. It is legitimate scholarly debate reaching critical mass. The academic establishment's concerns were never dishonest. Caution is appropriate when interpreting fragmentary evidence from vanished civilizations, but dismissal is no longer defensible. The evidence is too substantial, too consistent, too technologically verified. The question has evolved. It is no longer did Egyptian priests use mind-altering substances. The chemical signatures answer that yes. The real question, the one this documentary pursues, is deeper. What were they experiencing? What did they believe they were accessing? And why did it require secrecy so extreme that priests chose eternal erasure over revelation? But before we examine what the priests consumed, we need to understand who they were, and why their minds were considered the most valuable resource in all of Egypt. A priest's training began at age 7. It ended if he survived around age 30, 23 years of preparation, longer than medical school, law school, and a PhD combined. And most of that time wasn't spent studying texts. It was spent rewiring how they experienced reality itself. Selection happened early, often before a child understood what was being decided about his future. Temple officials watched for specific markers. Family lineage mattered. Priestly knowledge often passed through bloodlines. Fathers training sons in traditions that predated written language. Physical perfection was non-negotiable. A child with any deformity, no matter how minor, was automatically excluded. The priests believed the body was a vessel for consciousness, and a flawed vessel couldn't safely contain what they intended to pour into it. But beyond lineage and physical form, the priests looked for something else. They called it receptivity, the ability to perceive things others couldn't. A child who saw patterns in chaos, who reported vivid dreams with precise detail, who seemed to sense emotions or events before they became obvious. Modern psychology might identify these children as highly sensitive or possessing synesthetic perception. The Egyptians saw them as naturally open to realms beyond ordinary awareness, and therefore ideal candidates for training that would push that openness to extremes. The first decade focused on literacy and memorization. Priests were among the tiny fraction of Egyptians who could read and write. An initiate spent years copying religious texts, astronomical tables, medical formularies, and dream interpretation guides. He learned mathematics sophisticated enough to calculate celestial events decades in advance. He studied medicine, not just herbal remedies but surgical techniques, anatomical knowledge derived from mummification, and diagnostic methods that required observing subtle changes in pulse, breath, and skin coloration. This intellectual foundation was only preparation. The real training began when an initiate entered the temple system as a junior priest. Here, education became experiential. Breath control exercises that could slow heart rate, lower body temperature, or induce states bordering on suspended animation. Fasting protocols that lasted weeks, designed to strip away the mind's dependence on physical comfort. Sleep manipulation, learning to function on minimal rest, to wake at precise intervals, to enter dream states while maintaining conscious awareness. The Egyptians understood something modern neuroscience has only recently confirmed. Consciousness is trainable. The brain is plastic, capable of rewiring itself through sustained practice. Priests spent years learning to enter trance states at will, to maintain focused awareness through physical discomfort, to perceive their own thought processes with the detachment of external observers. They practiced techniques for hours daily, pushing their minds the way athletes push their bodies, past comfort, past habit, into territory where the normal rules of perception began to dissolve. This wasn't recreational, it wasn't spiritual tourism or casual experimentation. These were specialists training precision instruments, their own minds, for purposes that required absolute control. Whatever substances priests eventually used, they approached them not as escape, but as tools that required mastery to wield safely. All this training served a specific purpose, preparing priests to safely navigate experiences that would destroy an untrained mind. But training alone wasn't enough. There were doors the mind couldn't open by itself, and the priests had keys. The temple kept records of everything. Every grain of incense, every drop of oil, every leaf and root, audited daily, guarded more carefully than gold. So why do we keep finding hidden stashes in priest bedrooms? Substances that appear in no inventory, that match no official recipe. Egyptian temples operated on a clearance system, as rigid as any modern intelligence agency. At the lowest level, Wab priests handled purification duties, washing statues, maintaining ritual cleanliness, preparing offerings for public ceremonies. They had access to common temple spaces and substances any Egyptian might recognize: natron for purification, basic incense blends, oils used in daily rituals. These priests could spend entire careers never glimpsing what happened in the temple's inner chambers. One level higher, Netja priests served the god directly. They entered the sanctuary, handled sacred objects, participated in rituals that occurred behind closed doors away from public view. Their access to substances expanded, certain resins reserved for deity offerings, specific plant preparations used in festivals, compounds too valuable or too potent for lower ranks to handle. But even Netja priests operated under strict supervision. Temple inventories tracked every substance they touched, weighed before and after use, discrepancies investigated immediately. Lector priests occupied a different category entirely. These were the ritual specialists who memorized and recited the most complex sacred texts. They understood the words that priests believed could reshape reality. Their access to substances reflected that dangerous knowledge. They could request materials for specific rituals, combine ingredients according to formulas passed through oral tradition, but even their privileges had limits. Certain substances required authorization from higher authority. Certain combinations were absolutely forbidden without supervision. At the apex sat the sem-priests, the ones who performed the most secret rites, who entered chambers so restricted that even their location within temple complexes was concealed from lower clergy. These priests had theoretical access to everything. Temple records show sem-priests requisitioning substances in quantities and combinations that suggest uses far beyond public ceremony, and those records are meticulous. Every substance logged, every amount measured to the grain, which makes the archaeological discoveries so disturbing. Hidden compartments in priest living quarters containing residues that don't match any temple inventory. Vessels buried beneath bedroom floors, holding compounds that appear in no official recipe. Chemical analyses revealing substances that were never part of sanctioned temple activities. These weren't simple storage areas, they were deliberate concealment. Priests hiding materials even from their own institutions. The temple system already controlled access to powerful substances. Priests, who reached high ranks, could legally requisition almost anything. So why maintain secret stores? Why risk discovery and punishment for substances you could theoretically obtain through official channels? 3 possibilities emerge. First, these substances were so dangerous that even temples that sanctioned other mind-altering compounds had forbidden them. Second, these were substances used for purposes the official priesthood didn't sanction, personal exploration beyond ritual requirements. Third, most intriguing, these substances were keys to experiences that existed outside the temple system entirely, knowledge that predated the institutions that tried to control it. But to understand what these priests were consuming, sanctioned or secret, we need to understand what grew along the Nile, and what the ancient world knew about the plants that still line its banks today. Behind the temple walls, there were gardens no ordinary Egyptian ever saw. Priests tended them in silence, following rituals for planting and harvesting that were as elaborate as the ceremonies for the gods themselves. And in those gardens grew plants that have never been identified, species that appear in ancient records but seem to have vanished from the earth. These weren't ordinary agricultural spaces. Temple gardens occupied specific locations within the sacred precinct, often surrounded by secondary walls that separated them even from areas accessible to lower-ranking priests. Archaeological excavations at Karnak, Dendera, and Medinet Habu have revealed the footprints of these cultivation areas, specialized beds with soil compositions different from surrounding earth, irrigation systems more sophisticated than those used for common crops, and boundary markers inscribed with warnings about unauthorized entry. The plants grown here served ritual purposes. Lotus, certainly, its flowers appear in countless temple scenes, and residue analysis confirms its presence in sacred contexts. Papyrus, used not just for writing but for specific ceremonial purposes. Mandrake, whose root's humanoid shape made it sacred across the ancient Mediterranean. But temple records reference dozens of other species using hieroglyphs that don't match any plant modern botanists can identify. Names like the plant that opens eyes and the white branch that brings silence appear in cultivation instructions, but correspond to no known Egyptian flora. Temple wall scenes show priests engaged in what can only be called botanical worship, figures kneeling before seedlings, performing gestures of reverence toward plants still in germination, priests receiving potted specimens from foreign delegations, tribute scenes where the plants themselves are clearly more valuable than gold or jewels accompanying them, ritual specialists harvesting specific plants during particular lunar phases, at precise times of day, following protocols that treated the plants as living extensions of divine power. The Egyptians practiced what we might call sacred botany. They believed certain plants didn't merely contain useful compounds, but housed divine presences. Growing these plants required more than agricultural skill. It demanded ritual purity, correct timing aligned with celestial events, and prayers spoken over the soil before seeds were planted. Harvesting wasn't gathering, it was negotiation with the consciousness the priests believed resided in the plant itself. Every stage of cultivation followed spiritual protocols as elaborate as temple ceremonies. This relationship went beyond pharmaceutical utility. Modern drug development treats plants as chemical factories to be optimized, and eventually synthesized. Egyptian priests treated them as partners in accessing consciousness beyond ordinary awareness. They cultivated relationships with these plants over decades, learned their seasons and requirements, spoke to them, made offerings to their spirits. The substances extracted from temple gardens weren't commodities, they were gifts from beings the priests considered alive in ways humans rarely acknowledged. But cultivation was only foundation. Temple records make clear that raw plants were rarely used directly. The most potent substances required processing, combinations, extractions, transformations that took place in chambers no outsider ever entered. Growing sacred plants was only the first step. What the priests did with them, in darkness, in secret, following knowledge passed through generations, was where the real mystery began. Modern chemistry textbooks say distillation was invented around 800 AD, but residue analysis from Egyptian vessels, dating to 1500 BC, shows concentrated alkaloids that can only be produced through distillation. Either someone rewrote history, or someone is wrong about what the Egyptians knew. Temple workshops have yielded apparatus that shouldn't exist. Ceramic vessels with unusual shapes, narrow necks, collection chambers, conduits that suggest liquid transfer, glassware showing heat stress patterns consistent with sustained high temperatures, equipment assemblies that don't match any documented Egyptian technology, but show unmistakable signs of use, residue buildup, thermal discoloration, chemical etching that occurs only through repeated exposure to specific compounds. The function of this apparatus wasn't immediately obvious. Early excavators catalogued them as votive objects or decorative pieces, but modern analysis tells a different story. Residues extracted from these vessels contain alkaloid concentrations impossible to achieve through simple brewing or burning. We're talking about compounds isolated at purities, requiring multi-step processes, techniques that shouldn't appear in any civilization until Persian alchemists developed them 2,000 years later. Take one specific case. A vessel recovered from a priest workshop at Abydos contained traces of a compound identified as a purified extract from blue lotus. But the concentration was remarkable, nearly 40% pure alkaloid content. Achieving that purity requires understanding not just that the plant contains active compounds, but where in the plant those compounds concentrate, how to extract them without destroying their molecular structure, and how to separate them from inactive plant matter. This is folk medicine. This is pharmaceutical chemistry. Another example, residues showing evidence of controlled fermentation followed by distillation. The molecular signatures indicate a two-stage process where plant material was first fermented to convert certain compounds into more volatile forms, then subjected to heat-based separation to concentrate those volatiles. The technique is sophisticated enough that modern ethnobotanists have struggled to reproduce it, using only technologies the Egyptians supposedly possessed. Scholarly debate on these findings is genuine and heated. Some researchers argue the residues indicate contamination from later periods, or that we're misinterpreting natural degradation patterns. Others suggest that distillation, like processes, could occur accidentally through pottery firing or food preparation. These are legitimate concerns. Archaeological chemistry is complex, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But the evidence keeps accumulating: multiple sites, multiple vessel types, consistent patterns of sophisticated processing, and most tellingly, the apparatus itself, designed with features that make sense only if you understand the chemistry they were supposedly not supposed to know. Perhaps the priests possessed techniques we've lost, methods that died with them when their oral traditions ended, knowledge that wasn't written down because it was too dangerous to record, passed only through direct teaching, vanishing when the last trained practitioner died without a successor. But of all the plants the priests cultivated, one dominated Egyptian consciousness like no other. Its image is carved into every temple. Its flowers crown every god. And for centuries, scholars assumed it was merely decorative. They were wrong. For over 100 years, experts looked at the blue lotus and saw a flower. They catalogued it as decoration, noted its beauty, moved on. Then someone actually tested it, and what they found explained why it appeared in more Egyptian art than any other image, including the gods themselves. Walk through any Egyptian museum collection, and you'll encounter it everywhere. Blue lotus flowers crown the heads of pharaohs in painted relief. Gods hold them delicately between divine fingers. Temple walls show entire fields of lotus blooms stretching toward eternity. Ceremonial vessels are shaped like opening lotus buds. Jewelry, furniture, architectural capitals. Everywhere the distinctive four-petaled flower appears, so ubiquitous that it becomes almost invisible through familiarity. Egyptologists catalogued thousands of these images. They noted the artistic conventions, tracked regional variations in how the lotus was depicted, wrote papers about its symbolic association with rebirth and creation. The explanation seemed obvious. Egyptians loved this flower, the way other cultures love roses or cherry blossoms. It was beautiful. It grew abundantly along the Nile, and its daily cycle of opening at dawn and closing at dusk made it a natural symbol for solar renewal. Case closed. Move on to more complex mysteries. Except the contexts kept nagging at researchers who paid attention. In the 1970s, ethnobotanists examining Egyptian art noticed something scholars focused purely on symbolism had missed. The lotus did appear randomly. It showed up in specific situations, banquet scenes where guests were clearly intoxicated, funerary rites marking transitions between life and death, moments of divine transformation where mortals encountered gods, and the way people interacted with it was peculiar. Figures in tomb paintings held lotus flowers directly to their noses, not casually but deliberately, inhaling with postures that suggested deep breathing. Their eyes were often closed. Their expressions weren't merely appreciative. They showed something closer to ecstasy, to transport, to altered awareness. Servants at banquets offered lotus flowers to guests with the same careful attention they gave to wine jars. Priests conducting rituals held lotus blooms while performing gestures associated with consciousness transformation. The pattern was undeniable once you looked for it. Blue lotus appeared more frequently in Egyptian art than any other single image, more than pharaohs, more than specific gods, more than any animal or object. For a purely decorative element, that is extraordinary. Egyptians depicted what mattered, what they believed was powerful, what they relied on for accessing states beyond ordinary awareness. What scholars had been calling decoration was documentation. What looked ornamental was operational. The blue lotus wasn't Egypt's favorite flower in the way we might have a favorite color. It was technology, sacred technology for altering consciousness, facilitating communication with divine realms, marking transitions between states of being. But beautiful theories mean nothing without hard evidence, and the evidence was about to arrive, not from ancient temples, but from a modern laboratory, in a result that would make headlines around the world. The lab report was unambiguous. Nymphea caerulea contains apomorphine and nuciferin, compounds that bind to dopamine receptors in the human brain. At low doses, profound relaxation. At high doses, vivid hallucinations. The ancient Egyptians had been painting their drug trips on temple walls for 3,000 years, and we thought they were just decorating. The breakthrough came in stages. In the 1970s, ethnobotanists, analyzing blue lotus, identified the first psychoactive alkaloids, compounds with molecular structures known to affect human consciousness. Apomorphine primarily, which acts on dopamine receptors involved in pleasure, reward, and perception. Nuciferin, which produces sedative effects and alters sensory processing. These weren't trace compounds or ambiguous findings. They were present in concentrations high enough to produce measurable effects on anyone who consumed them. But identifying compounds in a plant doesn't prove ancient use. The next step required analyzing actual Egyptian residues. Researchers examined vessels recovered from temple contexts. Specifically, wine jars found in ritual areas and priest quarters. The molecular signatures were unmistakable. Blue lotus had been infused into wine, creating concentrated preparations where the alcohol extracted and preserved the psychoactive alkaloids. The priests weren't just smelling the flowers, they were drinking them. Modern users who experimented with blue lotus describe effects that map precisely onto Egyptian ritual contexts. At low doses, perhaps a single flower infused in wine, the experience is primarily relaxing. Mild euphoria, reduced anxiety. A pleasant drowsiness that doesn't impair function, but softens the edges of ordinary consciousness. Increase the dose to 3 or 4 flowers and the effects intensify. Deep physical relaxation bordering on sedation. Enhanced tactile sensation. Colors seem more vivid, sounds more textured. Time perception shifts subtly, but at high doses, preparations using dozens of flowers or concentrated extracts, something different emerges. Users report boundary dissolution, the feeling that the separation between self and environment is permeable rather than absolute. Vivid, lucid dreams if consumed before sleep. Waking visions described as watching reality through a veil that is suddenly become transparent. One modern user described it as feeling like you are remembering something ancient rather than experiencing something new. A sensation of accessing knowledge that exists outside personal experience. These effects explain the iconography perfectly. Blue lotus at banquets. Those scenes show relaxation, euphoria, the loosening of social boundaries that accompanies mild intoxication. Blue lotus in funerary contexts. The boundary dissolution users describe would facilitate exactly what Egyptians claimed they were doing, helping the deceased navigate the transition from life to death, maintaining connection between the living and the dead. Blue lotus in scenes of divine transformation. Those show priests entering states where communication with gods became possible. Visionary experiences where ordinary perception gave way to something else. The chemistry validates what the art had been documenting all along. Egyptian temple walls weren't symbolic representations of abstract concepts. They were user reports, documentation of experiences that priests were having repeatedly, systematically, as part of their sacred duties. But here is where it gets strange. Blue lotus is real, and its effects are documented. So why isn't it at the end of the story? Because the residues found in priest quarters contain compounds that can be explained by blue lotus alone. Substances that shouldn't be there. Combinations that don't occur in any known plant. Blue lotus alone couldn't do what the priests needed. So they combined it with mandrake, with poppy, with something else. That something else has appeared in residue analysis from temples across Egypt. It matches no known plant. It produces compounds that shouldn't exist. And after 40 years of analysis, it still has no name. The evidence emerged gradually from vessel residues. Blue lotus alkaloids appeared consistently, but they were rarely alone. Chromatography revealed additional compounds in deliberate ratios repeated across multiple samples from different sites. Mandrake tropane alkaloids showed up frequently, scopolamine and atropine, substances that produce powerful sedative and deliriant effects. Poppy-derived compounds appeared in others, morphine precursors that would deepen sedation into profound trance states. These weren't accidental contaminations. The ratios were too consistent, too precise. A vessel from Karnak might contain blue lotus combined with mandrake in a 3-to-1 ratio. A vessel from Dendera, 500 miles away, shows the identical proportion. Abydos, Edfu, temples across the Egyptian world. The formulas match. This wasn't independent experimentation. It was standardized knowledge passed through the priestly network with pharmaceutical precision. The combinations make pharmacological sense. Blue lotus provides visionary qualities and boundary dissolution. Add mandrake, and you introduce powerful anticholinergic effects. Altered perception, dissociation from the body, states where the line between internal experience and external reality becomes negotiable. The sedative qualities of mandrake would counterbalance the stimulating aspects of lotus alkaloids, creating a controlled drift rather than overwhelming intensity. Throw in poppy compounds, and you add profound physical relaxation that would allow consciousness to detach almost completely from bodily awareness. Priests weren't randomly mixing plants. They were engineering specific states of consciousness through calculated combinations, adjusting ratios to produce experiences tailored to particular ritual purposes. Need contact with the dead. This formula, seeking direct communication with deity. That one, preparing for initiatory experiences that would permanently alter the initiate's perception. A third combination, more potent, reserved for moments when transformation was the explicit goal. But here is where explanation runs into mystery. Every residue containing these known combinations also contains something else. trace compounds that don't match anything in our botanical databases, molecular structures that suggest plant origin but don't correspond to any species documented in ancient Egypt or known to grow in the region. Some samples show as many as 4 or 5 unidentified compounds alongside the recognized ones. Initial theories suggested degradation, molecules transformed by millennia into forms we no longer recognize. But degradation typically produces predictable breakdown products. These compounds show structural complexity that shouldn't survive long-term decay. They appear to be stable alkaloids or terpenoids, unchanged across thousands of years. Other researchers propose extinct species, plants that grew along the Nile in antiquity, but vanished through climate change or overcultivation. Possible, but we'd expect to find their pollen in sediment cores, their remains in other archaeological contexts. The complete absence of corroborating evidence is puzzling. A third theory involves foreign imports from regions beyond our current evidence. Perhaps priests maintain trade networks specifically for psychoactive materials, bringing plants from Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Mediterranean islands in quantities too small to leave obvious archaeological traces. The unidentified compounds might represent rare botanicals whose trade was so restricted, so closely guarded, that only priestly contexts preserve their chemical signatures. But while lotus and its combinations account for some of what we've found, they don't explain the strangest discoveries. Substances that weren't consumed at all, but inhaled applied to skin, and even injected through methods we still don't fully understand. The Blue Lotus story answers one question. Yes, Egyptian priests used mind-altering substances systematically, but it opens a door to harder questions, because the lotus, powerful as it is, can't explain the most disturbing discoveries. The residues that aren't plant-based at all, the compounds that seem designed to do something far stranger than produce visions. Understanding Blue Lotus forces us to recognize something uncomfortable. Ancient peoples possessed sophisticated relationships with consciousness, altering plants that Western scholarship spent centuries denying. The lotus tradition didn't die with ancient Egypt. It continued, transformed but recognizable, through cultures that inherited Egyptian knowledge. Greek accounts describe lotus eaters along the North African coast, people who consumed a flower that produced forgetfulness and euphoric detachment. The descriptions match Blue Lotus effects precisely. Indian tantric practices reference a sacred blue flower used in meditation and deity visualization. Traditional African medicine, particularly along the Upper Nile, never forgot the lotus. Practitioners today still prepare it for spiritual purposes, maintaining knowledge that academic Egyptology dismissed as impossible. Why was this knowledge lost to Western scholars for so long? The answer reveals more about Victorian-era academia than ancient Egypt. 19th century Egyptologists couldn't reconcile their image of Egypt as a great civilization with the possibility of systematic drug use. They associated mind-altering substances with primitive cultures, not sophisticated societies that produced literature, mathematics, and monumental architecture. The cognitive dissonance was too great, so they interpreted lotus imagery as purely symbolic decoration celebrating rebirth, not documentation of actual practices. This scholarly tradition persisted into the 20th century. Generations of researchers trained to see symbolism where evidence suggested literal use. The possibility that priests were getting systematically intoxicated contradicted the narrative of Egyptian civilization that museums presented to the public, that textbooks taught to students. It was easier to maintain the established interpretation than confront evidence that challenged comfortable assumptions. The Blue Lotus revelation represents both breakthrough and warning. Breakthrough. We now understand one piece of Egyptian ritual technology with chemical certainty. Warning, how many other misinterpretations are hiding in plain sight? How much knowledge have we failed to recognize because it contradicted what we assumed ancient peoples couldn't know or wouldn't do? The lotus is powerful, genuinely psychoactive, used systematically across Egyptian civilization for specific purposes. That is established, but it is incomplete explanation. The residues tell us priests were doing more than consuming lotus wine at banquets. They were creating sophisticated preparations involving multiple plants and unidentified compounds. They were engineering consciousness, states with pharmaceutical precision, and the lotus, for all its importance, was just the beginning. The lotus opened minds. But the priests needed more than open minds. They needed specific experiences, repeatable states, precise visions that matched their theological expectations. And for that, they turned to something far more mysterious: the substances they burned. We've always assumed Egyptian incense was about smell, but the temples were designed to trap smoke, not release it. Chambers with no windows, corridors that funneled air inward. Priests spent hours in clouds so thick they could barely see. This wasn't air freshener. It was architecture designed for maximum absorption of whatever they were burning. The Egyptian word for incense tells us everything scholars missed. Seneca, it doesn't mean fragrant substance or offering smoke. It translates directly as to make divine, a verb describing transformation, not description. Incense wasn't something that smelled holy. It was something that made the inhaler holy, that converted ordinary consciousness into states where communication with gods became possible. Understanding smoke inhalation changes everything about Egyptian ritual. When you burn plant material, combustion transforms molecular structures. Heat breaks down complex compounds into simpler, more volatile forms. Some substances that are barely active when consumed orally become dramatically more potent when heated and inhaled. The lungs offer massive surface area for absorption, hundreds of millions of alveoli, creating direct pathways to the bloodstream. Substances absorbed through the lungs reach the brain within seconds, far faster than digestion. Suddenly, temple architecture makes new sense. Those enclosed sanctuaries weren't design failures. Poor ventilation wasn't an oversight corrected by later builders. The spaces were deliberately constructed to contain smoke, to ensure priests performing rituals in inner chambers would be enveloped in concentrated clouds for extended periods. Stone corridors channeled air inward, but not outward. Ceiling heights were calculated to create optimal smoke density at breathing level. Windows appeared in outer courts where public ceremonies occurred, but disappeared as you moved deeper into restricted areas. The most famous Egyptian incense is kifi, a formula so important that multiple versions of its recipe survived in temple inscriptions and later Greek texts. 13 ingredients mixed in precise proportions: wine, honey, juniper, berries, myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and 7 other components whose identification remains debated. Ancient sources describe kifi as inducing visions, easing anxiety, and producing dreams so vivid they felt prophetic. Modern analysis of kifi ingredients reveals several with documented psychoactive properties. Myrrh contains compounds affecting opioid receptors. Juniper has mild sedative effects. Cinnamon influences neurotransmitter activity. But the real potency likely came from synergy, combinations creating effects none of the individual components could produce alone. Wine and honey weren't just binders. They were fermentation agents, potentially transforming other ingredients during the mixture's mandatory aging period. But here is what matters. The kifi formulas that survived are explicitly described as public versions, incense burned in outer temples for general purification, available to any priest of sufficient rank. Temple documents reference this openly, distinguishing between the kifi known to scribes and the kifi of the innermost chamber. The secret formulas were never written down. They existed only in oral tradition, passed from dying priest to successor, in those sealed rooms where knowledge too dangerous for recording was transmitted through whispered instruction. But in the innermost chambers, where only the highest priests entered, they burned something else entirely, something that left residues we're still trying to identify. In 2008, researchers published a finding that should have changed how we understand every ancient religion that burned incense. Frankincense is psychoactive. It activates specific receptors in the brain. Inhaling it doesn't. Tea just smell nice. It changes consciousness. And the ancient Egyptians burned it by the ton. The study came from Johns Hopkins University and Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Researchers analyzing boswellia resin, the tree sap we call frankincense, isolated a compound called incensol acetate. When they tested it, they discovered something remarkable. Incensol acetate binds to TRPV3 channels in the brain, the same receptors involved in temperature sensation and, more importantly, emotional regulation. The compound produces measurable anxiolytic effects. It reduces anxiety. It triggers antidepressant responses, and in sufficient concentrations, it induces mild altered states, characterized by feelings of warmth, expansion, and what test subjects described as spiritual openness. This wasn't tea subtle. The effects were dose, dependent, and reproducible. Mice exposed to frankincense smoke showed decreased anxiety behaviors and altered brain chemistry. Human subjects reported measurable shifts in mood and perception. The researchers concluded that burning frankincense during religious ceremonies wasn't just about creating atmosphere. It was pharmacologically altering the consciousness of everyone in the room. Context makes this discovery stunning. Frankincense was the most expensive substance in the ancient world. Trade routes stretched from southern Arabia across thousands of miles specifically to move this resin to Mediterranean civilizations. Egyptian records document frankincense imports in quantities that seem absurd. Tons of it consumed annually by major temples. The cost was staggering. Pharaohs mounted military expeditions partly to secure frankincense sources. Queens sent diplomatic missions to the land of Punt with frankincense procurement as primary objective. Why that expense, that effort, for something scholars assumed was merely aromatic? Because the Egyptians knew what modern science took until 2008 to discover. Frankincense changes how you think, how you feel, how you perceive reality. It wasn't tea decoration. It was technology. Egyptian temple texts specify frankincense for the innermost rituals, not the public ceremonies but the secret rites performed in sealed chambers by the highest priests. Standard interpretation held this was because frankincense was too expensive to waste on common worship, but expense alone doesn't explain the pattern. Temples controlled enormous wealth. They could afford frankincense for any purpose. The restriction wasn't economic, it was functional. Frankincense was reserved for situations where altered consciousness was the explicit goal. The discovery timeline reveals something about scientific blind spots. Frankincense has been studied chemically for over a century. Researchers knew its molecular composition, but nobody looked for psychoactive compounds because the paradigm said they wouldn't be there. Incense was about smell. Aromatherapy was placebo effect, dressed up in pleasant scents. The possibility that smoke inhalation might alter brain chemistry through specific receptor activation wasn't in the research frame. What changed? Gradually, scientists studying ancient practices stopped dismissing them as superstition and started asking, what if these people knew things we don't? What if their claims about consciousness alteration were literally true? That shift in perspective, taking ancient assertions seriously rather than explaining them away, opened doors to discoveries that had been hiding in plain sight. Frankincense was valuable, but it was also available. Any wealthy temple could afford it. The real mystery lies in the substances that weren't traded, weren't written about, weren't supposed to exist at all. The chromatograph doesn't lie. It reads molecular signatures with precision that ancient priests couldn't have imagined. So when it returns, compound unknown, on samples from Egyptian temple incense, after being tested against databases containing millions of organic molecules, the question isn't whether the machine is wrong. The question is, what were the priests burning? At Karnak, archaeologists recovered carbonized material from incense burners in chambers where rituals had been conducted for over 1,000 years. The residue looked ordinary enough under visual inspection, blackened organic matter, the expected aftermath of combustion. But when subjected to gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, something unexpected emerged. The organic compounds present didn't match any known incense ingredient. Not frankincense, not myrrh, not any of the dozens of resins, woods, and plant materials known to have been traded in the ancient world. The molecular structure simply didn't correspond to anything in the reference libraries. Researchers expanded their search. Perhaps these were regional plants that hadn't been catalogued for their aromatic properties. Perhaps the compounds had degraded in unusual ways over millennia, but even accounting for chemical breakdown and transformation, the signatures remained anomalous. What the priests had been burning wasn't identifiable. Abydos presented a different puzzle. Residues there showed combustion products of plant materials that appeared to originate from ecosystems Egypt never had access to, or at least never had documented access to. The chemical markers suggested tropical species, but from regions beyond Egypt's known trade networks. Either the trade routes were more extensive than historical records indicate, or these plants came from somewhere we haven't accounted for. Or perhaps they're extinct. Species that vanished before modern botanical science could catalogue them, leaving only molecular ghosts in temple ash. But the most unsettling findings involved what appeared to be synthetic compounds. Not naturally occurring substances at all, but molecules that seem to have been created through deliberate chemical processes. The combustion residues contain structures that don't form through simple burning of plant material. They looked engineered. Researchers who published these findings chose their words carefully, noting that calling something synthetic requires proving intentional manufacture, something impossible to demonstrate from ancient residue alone. Yet the alternative explanations seemed equally implausible. One chemist, who spent 15 years analysing temple incense samples, wrote in a journal article that the work had left him professionally humbled. Another noted that each advancement in analytical technology, each new method for identifying compounds at smaller concentrations, produced more questions rather than answers. The substances weren't becoming clearer with better equipment. They were becoming stranger. We can't claim these unexplained compounds prove anything extraordinary. Absence of identification isn't evidence of impossibility. But after decades of analysis, after testing against millions of known molecules, these residues from Egyptian temples remain unclassified. The priests were burning something. We just don't know what. But smoke was only one pathway into altered states. The priests had others. Methods that left marks, not in incense burners, but on the bodies of the priests themselves. The inner chamber at Dendera has no windows, no ventilation, and a ceiling covered in 3,000 years of accumulated smoke residue. Egyptologists called it poor design. Archaeochemists recognized it for what it was, the most sophisticated drug delivery system the ancient world ever built. When researchers analyzed the residue patterns on those chamber walls, they found something unexpected. The accumulation wasn't random, it showed deliberate circulation. Smoke moving in controlled patterns, trapped and redirected by architectural features designed precisely for that purpose. The ceiling wasn't just covered in soot. It was layered with centuries of carefully managed combustion, deposited in ways that revealed intentional airflow manipulation. The temple's inner spaces aren't just rooms. They're a progression. A priest entering the sanctuary would move through chambers that grew progressively smaller, each one thicker with smoke than the last. The architecture creates a gradient of exposure, preparing the body and mind through increasing doses before reaching the final space. That innermost chamber would have been nearly opaque with smoke, visibility reduced to nothing, concentration maximally dense. A priest kneeling there would be breathing almost pure incense vapor. Religious texts describe this journey as approaching the god through clouds. Scholars interpreted that metaphorically as poetic language for spiritual transcendence, but the architecture suggests those clouds were literal. The texts weren't describing metaphor. They were describing the physical experience of moving through smoke-filled chambers toward an encounter designed to overwhelm the senses. The engineering is subtle but deliberate. Ceiling shapes trap smoke and circulate it downward rather than letting it rise and dissipate. Door placements create specific pressure differentials, pulling smoke into certain chambers while keeping others relatively clear. The absence of ventilation isn't an oversight, it is the entire point. These spaces were sealed intentionally, designed to contain and concentrate whatever was being burned within them. Modern visitors walk through these temples and see stone walls, narrow corridors, chambers that feel claustrophobic. They assume ancient builders simply worked with what they had, creating spaces that happened to be small and poorly lit. But the archaeochemical evidence tells a different story. These weren't buildings designed for worship in the way we understand it. They were delivery systems. Every architectural choice, the ceiling height, the chamber size, the placement of doorways, served a pharmacological purpose. The priests who entered these inner sanctums weren't just performing rituals. They were subjecting themselves to controlled exposure in environments engineered to maximize absorption. The temple delivered the substance. The architecture ensured it reached the practitioner at precise concentrations, in specific sequences, building toward an experience that transformed consciousness through deliberate chemical intervention. The smoke worked. But for the most powerful rituals, the ceremonies that made contact with death itself, they needed something more direct. They needed substances that entered the blood. The anointing ritual was considered so sacred that performing it incorrectly meant death. For centuries, we assumed the punishment reflected spiritual offense. Then we analyzed what was in the oil and realized that applying it incorrectly might have meant literal death. The priests weren't anointing with symbolism, they were anointing with psychoactive compounds potent enough to kill. Anointing was everywhere in Egyptian religious practice. Priests underwent anointing before entering temples. Pharaohs received it before coronations. The dead were anointed elaborately before burial. Even divine statues required daily application of sacred oils. The ritual appeared in every significant ceremonial context, performed with precise technique by authorized personnel only. Conventional Egyptology interpreted this as symbolic purification, oil representing divine favor, cleansing, or transformation. The elaborate protocols were understood as expressing the ritual's spiritual importance. Chemical analysis suggests we misunderstood completely. The oils weren't symbolic, they were pharmaceutical. Surviving samples contain concentrated plant alkaloids that serve no purpose in ordinary oil compounds, with no moisturizing properties, no pleasant scent, no function except their effect on human physiology, and those effects are significant. These substances, when dissolved in fat-based carriers, penetrate skin and enter bloodstream directly. They bypass digestion, avoid liver metabolism, and reach circulation in forms the body can't easily clear. This is transdermal absorption, a delivery method modern medicine recognizes as highly efficient for certain drugs. The concentrations are telling. These weren't trace amounts from casual contact with plants. The oils contained deliberate extracts, prepared through processes that required understanding cause and effect. Someone knew that certain plants, when processed and concentrated, produced compounds that entered the body through skin. Someone knew that oil was the appropriate carrier medium. Someone understood dosing. The elaborate protocols now read differently. Instructions about who could anoint whom, which oils on which body parts, in what order, under which conditions, weren't religious choreography. They were pharmaceutical protocols. The restrictions on unauthorized anointing weren't protecting divine mysteries, they were preventing accidental poisoning. Apply too much, apply to the wrong area where absorption rates differ, mix incompatible compounds, and the person being anointed might experience effects ranging from unpleasant to fatal. The death penalty for improper anointing makes practical sense if the oils contained substances potent enough to kill. The punishment wasn't for spiritual transgression, it was consequence reflecting material risk. A priest anointing someone incorrectly wasn't just violating protocol, he was administering potentially lethal drugs without proper training. The severity of punishment matched the severity of pharmacological danger. This reframes thousands of years of religious imagery. Every scene showing anointing, every text describing the ritual, every reference to sacred oils. They weren't depicting symbolic acts, they were documenting pharmaceutical administration. The priests who mastered anointing weren't ritual specialists. They were trained in transdermal drug delivery, working from knowledge accumulated across generations of careful observation about which substances in which carriers applied where produced which effects. But general anointing oils, while potent, were standardized across the priestly class. There was another category of oil, the unguents reserved for only the highest rituals, applied to specific body parts for specific purposes, and their compositions remain among the strangest substances we've ever recovered from ancient Egypt. The Eye of Horus appears more than any other symbol in Egyptian religion, representing divine perception, magical sight, the ability to see what mortals cannot. Then researchers noticed something strange. The symbol isn't stylized, it is anatomically accurate. It maps exactly to the nerves and blood vessels surrounding the human eye. And those are exactly the places where priests applied their most mysterious substances. Look at any Egyptian temple wall, and you'll find the Eye of Horus repeated endlessly. Scholars have catalogued thousands of depictions showing priests and pharaohs being anointed specifically around the eyes with dark-coloured unguents. The ritual focus on eyes seemed natural. Eyes connect to divine vision, spiritual sight, perception beyond the ordinary. The symbolism appeared obvious, but the anatomical precision of the symbol suggests something else was happening. The skin around the human eye is among the thinnest anywhere on the body. Blood vessels run close to the surface. Substances applied here don't just sit on skin, They absorb rapidly and efficiently, entering circulation faster than applications almost anywhere else. Modern transdermal drug patches are often placed near the eyes for exactly this reason. The bioavailability is exceptional. Whatever you apply here reaches the bloodstream quickly and in relatively unaltered form. The neural connections matter too. Nerves in this region don't just serve the eye itself. They connect directly to areas of the brain involved in visual processing, in interpreting what we see, in constructing the images consciousness experiences as sight. Affect these pathways and you don't just change what the eye detects. You change how the brain interprets detection. You alter perception itself. Residue analysis of Egyptian eye cosmetics reveals more than decorative compounds. Yes, the famous coal contained lead sulfide, creating the distinctive dark appearance. But chemical testing shows plant-derived substances mixed into these cosmetics. Alkaloids with known effects on neural function, compounds that influence how signals travel from retina to brain. The cosmetics weren't just makeup, they were delivery systems for substances that would change what priests saw during rituals. We can't claim certainty. Eye applications served multiple purposes: protection from sun glare, symbolic identification with divine sight, aesthetic presentation. But the pharmacological evidence keeps accumulating. Certain unguents applied around the eyes contained concentrated extracts with no purpose except their neurological effects. The priests were applying these substances precisely where anatomy suggests they would work best, where thin skin and dense vascularization ensure rapid absorption, where neural pathways provide direct access to visual processing centers. The Eye of Horus may have been exactly what it claimed to be, a guide to seeing what mortals cannot. Not through metaphor or magic, but through careful application of compounds that alter visual perception. The symbol encoded practical knowledge. It showed where to apply substances. It marked the anatomical target point for achieving altered sight. Divine vision wasn't metaphysical, it was pharmacological. The priests had mapped the pathway, but the priests didn't stop at the eyes. For the most powerful rituals, ceremonies meant to communicate with the dead, they applied substances to parts of the body that suggest something even more radical than transdermal absorption. The opening of the mouth ceremony was the most important ritual in Egyptian religion. No soul could survive without it. For 3,000 years, scholars assumed it was symbolic. Then they analyzed the instruments and found residues suggesting the priests weren't miming actions. They were applying substances directly to the most absorptive tissue in the human body. Every properly prepared mummy underwent this ceremony. So did divine statues before they were considered inhabited by gods. The ritual involved touching specific implements to the mouth and eyes while reciting carefully prescribed spells. Egyptologists understood this as symbolic restoration, magically returning the ability to breathe, eat, and speak to beings that had lost or never possessed those functions. The touching was metaphorical. The implements were props in spiritual theatre. But when researchers examined the actual tools recovered from tombs, the ritual instruments priests carried into burial chambers, they found something unexpected. The surfaces weren't clean, they bore residues indicating repeated use with substances. These weren't ceremonial objects touched symbolically to stone lips. They were application tools, used to deliver something to the mouth and its surrounding tissues. The mucous membranes lining the mouth absorb substances faster than skin can. Place a compound there, and it enters bloodstream almost immediately, bypassing digestive breakdown entirely. Modern medicine recognizes sublingual administration as one of the most efficient delivery routes for drugs requiring rapid onset. The priests apparently recognized this too. What makes the opening of the mouth even stranger is evidence that a version of this ceremony was performed on living priests before certain high rituals. Not just on the dead being prepared for the afterlife, but on the living being prepared for something else. Texts describe senior priests undergoing mouth opening procedures before entering the deepest temple sanctuaries, the same procedures used on mummies, but performed on the breathing. This raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the ritual's purpose wasn't symbolic preparation for death. Perhaps it was literal preparation for experiencing death while remaining alive. The substances applied to the mouth might have induced states so profound that priests believed they had actually crossed into the realm of the dead and returned. Near-death experiences, pharmacologically triggered, mistaken for, or perhaps identical to genuine contact with the afterlife. The implements would touch the tongue, the inner cheeks, the soft tissue beneath the tongue, where blood vessels cluster close. Substances absorbed there would reach the brain within seconds. Effects would be immediate, intense, and potentially overwhelming. A priest undergoing this procedure wouldn't gradually enter an altered state. He would be thrust into it, consciousness transformed before he could prepare or resist. We don't know what substances the priests used. Residue analysis shows organic compounds, but degradation prevents precise identification. We know only that something was applied, something potent enough that 3 millennia of practitioners considered this the ritual that mattered most, the ceremony without which nothing else worked. The priests consumed lotus preparations, breathed sacred smoke, and applied substances through their skin and mouth. But we haven't yet addressed the strangest vessels we found, containers whose shapes suggest they delivered substances in a way that seems impossibly advanced for the ancient world. In 1897, archaeologists found gold needles in a priest's tomb. They were hollow. They had no obvious purpose, too fine for sewing, too small for any known medical procedure. For over a century they sat in museum storage unexplained. Then someone looked at them next to modern hypodermic needles. The dimensions were nearly identical. This is where the documentary enters genuinely contested territory. The suggestion that ancient Egyptians practiced any form of injection remains deeply controversial among Egyptologists and medical historians. The evidence exists, but its interpretation divides scholars sharply. The artifacts are real. Hollow needles, fashioned from gold and bronze, have been recovered from priestly burial contexts. They are too fine for textile work. Their bores are too narrow for any conventional explanation. Some are accompanied by small vessels with narrow extended openings, containers whose design would make pouring impractical, but would work perfectly for forcing liquid under pressure through a restricted channel. Medical papyri add to the puzzle. Certain texts describe inserting substances through the skin, using phrasing that goes beyond standard wound treatment or topical application. The language suggests penetration, not just surface contact. One passage instructs practitioners to pierce to the depth of a barleycorn when administering certain preparations, a measurement implying controlled insertion to specific shallow depths. Skeptics present strong counterarguments. Injection, they note, requires more than just hollow needles. It requires understanding of sterile technique to avoid infection. It requires knowledge that substances in bloodstream produce different effects than substances consumed orally. It requires conceptual frameworks about circulation and absorption that supposedly didn't exist until much later. Furthermore, similar practices aren't documented anywhere else in the ancient world. Why would this technology appear in Egypt and nowhere else? Proponents respond that we are not discussing deep intramuscular injection requiring modern medical knowledge. Superficial injection into skin layers, essentially controlled puncture with substance delivery, is technically simple. Ancient peoples practiced tattooing, which involves repeated skin penetration with pigment delivery. Scarification rituals existed across cultures, demonstrating comfort with deliberate skin breaking. Extending these practices to liquid delivery isn't conceptually revolutionary. The absence of evidence elsewhere might simply reflect preservation bias or misidentification of artifacts. The debate remains unresolved. What makes it significant isn't whether Egyptians definitely practiced injection. That question may never be answered conclusively. What matters is that the evidence is strong enough that serious scholars debate it at all. The artifacts exist. The medical texts exist. The fact that we even discussing ancient injection technology reveals how little we actually know about Egyptian medical and pharmacological sophistication. Whether those hollow needles delivered substances through skin or served some purpose we have imagined, their existence challenges comfortable assumptions. We expect ancient civilizations to work within certain technological boundaries. When artifacts appear that suggest they might have exceeded those boundaries, our first instinct is to find alternative explanations. Sometimes that instinct is correct, sometimes it prevents us from seeing what is actually there. But whether or not the priests injected substances, one thing is certain. Everything we've examined so far, the lotus, the smoke, the oils, served a purpose. They weren't recreational, they were tools. And to understand what these tools were for, we need to examine what the priests were trying to achieve. We think of hallucinations as distortions, the brain showing us things that aren't there. The Egyptians would have found this idea bizarre. For them, visions weren't malfunction, they were function, the mind finally working correctly, seeing what was always there but normally hidden from limited human perception. Understanding Egyptian substance use requires understanding how Egyptians understood reality itself. Their cosmos wasn't a single plane of existence. It was layered, multiple dimensions occupying the same space, separated not by distance but by perceptual access. The visible world humans normally inhabited was just one layer. Beyond it lay the duat, the realm of the dead where souls journeyed after death. Beyond that stretched the field of reeds, the paradise where the worthy spent eternity. And woven through everything were the domains of deities, spaces where divine beings existed in forms humans couldn't ordinarily perceive. Crucially, these weren't metaphors. Modern readers encounter descriptions of the duat and assume the Egyptians were speaking poetically about psychological states or abstract spiritual concepts. But the textual evidence suggests they believed these realms existed as objectively as the Nile. They had geography, they had inhabitants, they had rules governing what happened within them. And most importantly, properly trained individuals could access them while living cool to perceive these dimensions, communicate with their inhabitants, and return with knowledge impossible to obtain through ordinary means. This framework transforms how we understand priestly substance use. The priests weren't seeking escape from reality. They were seeking fuller access to reality. Human perception, in their model, was naturally limited, restricted to one narrow band of existence, blind to the surrounding dimensions that encompassed most of what was real. Mind-altering substances weren't distortions. They were corrections. They removed perceptual limitations. They allowed consciousness to function as it was meant to, perceiving across the full spectrum of layered reality, rather than remaining trapped in one narrow slice. This belief system extreme secrecy surrounding these practices. If substances genuinely opened doorways to other realms, unprepared access wasn't just spiritually dangerous, it was practically dangerous. Entering the duat without proper knowledge meant encountering beings and forces you couldn't manage. The realm of the dead wasn't safe for the living. It required specific protocols, specific knowledge. Letting untrained individuals access these dimensions would be like giving nuclear codes to children. Not immoral due to arbitrary rules, but reckless because the danger was real. Modern viewers will naturally question whether Egyptian priests actually contacted other dimensions or simply experienced pharmacologically induced brain states. But for the priests themselves, this distinction wouldn't have made sense. Brain states and dimensions of reality weren't separate categories. Consciousness was how you perceived reality. Altering consciousness meant perceiving different aspects of reality, whether those aspects existed objectively independent of perception or subjectively, as brain phenomena would have seemed like asking whether the Nile exists objectively or is just something we perceive. The question misunderstands the relationship between mind and world. The Egyptians believed in a layered reality, but they didn't take substances casually. Each ritual had specific goals, specific beings to contact, specific knowledge to retrieve, and the records they left suggest their experiences were surprisingly consistent. When scientists compare accounts of DMT experiences, ayahuasca visions, and near-death encounters, they find disturbing consistency. Beings of light, passage through tunnels, vast architectural spaces, entities that communicate telepathically. The Egyptian priests described exactly the same things. 3,000 years before anyone synthesized DMT. The textual records are surprisingly specific. Priests didn't just report vague spiritual feelings or abstract communion with the divine. They documented encounters with distinct categories of beings, described with consistent details across centuries of practice. These weren't personal interpretations varying wildly between individuals. They were standardized experiences, reported with remarkable agreement by practitioners, separated by generations. The traditional gods appeared most frequently. Ra manifested as overwhelming light, sometimes too brilliant to perceive directly. Osiris presented as a figure of green-tinged darkness, associated with death, but not threatening, judges more than executioners. Thoth appeared in forms that shifted between human and ibis, headed, speaking in ways priests described as both auditory and somehow beyond sound. communication that bypassed language entirely. These weren't vague presences, they were beings with consistent appearance, consistent personalities, consistent behaviors. The Aku, the blessed dead, represented another category. Priests reported contacting deceased predecessors who could provide information about navigating the afterlife. Some accounts describe conversations with specific named individuals, relatives of temple patrons who wanted knowledge about their loved ones' conditions. The Aku offered guidance, warnings, and occasionally information that priests claimed they couldn't have known through normal means, whether these were genuine contacts or elaborate confabulations based on expectation. The consistency is striking, but the most intriguing accounts involve entities that don't fit Egyptian mythology neatly. Marginal texts mention beings encountered in deep duate journeys, figures that couldn't be identified with known gods that seemed to exist outside established categories. Some are described as geometric rather than anthropomorphic. Others appeared as presences without visual form, recognized through sensation rather than sight. These accounts are fragmentary, mentioned briefly in texts, primarily concerned with other matters, suggesting experiences so unusual they challenged the very frameworks meant to categorize spiritual encounters. The structural patterns match modern reports with unsettling precision. Passage through darkness or tunnels before reaching illuminated spaces. Encounters with beings that communicate without speaking. Vast architectural structures that seem both ancient and impossible. A sense of encountering intelligence fundamentally different from human consciousness, yet somehow able to interact meaningfully. Knowledge conveyed not through words but through direct transfer. Information appearing in consciousness fully formed. This consistency raises profound questions. Are these patterns products of universal brain chemistry, psychoactive compounds triggering similar neurological responses across all humans regardless of culture? Or do different cultures simply access the same actual realm through different means? The Egyptian priests would have rejected the first explanation entirely. For them, consistency proved authenticity. If multiple priests across centuries encountered the same beings, that verified the being's objective existence. The alternative, that human brains simply hallucinate similarly, wouldn't have made sense within their model of consciousness and reality. But visions were only part of what priests sought. For the most sacred purposes, they weren't trying to see other realms, they were trying to bring something back. The Ebers papyrus contains medical knowledge that shouldn't be there, descriptions of heart function that wouldn't be discovered. For 2,000 years, herbal preparations whose effectiveness modern pharmacology confirms. The Egyptians credited this knowledge to Thoth, who revealed it during temple rituals. We assumed this was mythology. But what if it was methodology? The priests didn't just report seeing visions during their altered state practices. They claimed to retrieve information, practical knowledge they brought back and recorded for future use. Medical texts frequently attribute their contents to divine revelation received during temple ceremonies. Astronomical tables credit their precision to communications with sky deities. Mathematical principles appear in documents that describe them as gifts from Thoth, delivered to priests who had properly prepared themselves through ritual. Modern analysis of these texts reveals something unexpected. The knowledge isn't always what we'd expect from the era. The Ebers papyrus describes heart function in ways that suggest understanding of circulation, concepts European medicine wouldn't articulate until Harvey's work in the 17th century. Herbal remedies documented in temple archives use plant combinations that modern pharmacological analysis confirms as chemically sensible, targeting conditions in ways that shouldn't have been knowable through trial and error alone. Astronomical knowledge presents similar puzzles. Egyptian priests calculated celestial cycles with precision that should have required centuries of meticulous observation. Yet some of these calculations appear in texts from periods when continuous observational records don't exist. The priests attributed this knowledge to revelation, gods who showed them patterns that would take lifetimes to map empirically. Mathematical sophistication appears in similar contexts. Principles that modern mathematicians recognize as genuinely advanced are presented in religious texts as knowledge received from Thoth during altered state encounters. The Egyptians didn't claim to have figured these out, they claimed to have been shown them. It is entirely possible this was simply how Egyptians credited discoveries. Perhaps priests made observations, performed calculations, conducted experiments, and then attributed their results to divine revelation because that framework made cultural sense. The divine attribution might have been storytelling, not methodology. But we should note that this pattern isn't uniquely Egyptian. Indigenous cultures with documented entheogenic traditions make identical claims. Amazonian shamans credit their extensive botanical knowledge to teachings received from plant spirits during ayahuasca ceremonies. They describe learning which plants treat, which conditions not through experimentation, but through direct instruction from entities encountered in visionary states. Siberian peoples attribute their astronomical knowledge to communications with sky spirits, accessed through ritual practices. The pattern repeats across unconnected cultures, altered states as epistemology, not just experience, whether priests actually received knowledge through supernatural means or simply believed they did. The practical result was the same. They treated visionary practices as productive ways of knowing, not recreation, not mere spiritual fulfillment, but actual research methodology, a means of acquiring information about the physical world that couldn't be obtained through ordinary observation. The priests themselves never questioned whether this worked. For them, the question was absurd. Knowledge obtained through proper ritual was knowledge, regardless of how it was acquired. The method didn't determine validity, results did. But knowledge wasn't the only thing priests brought back from their journeys. They brought back something more tangible and more disturbing. They brought back changes to their own bodies. The priest's hair told a story. Chemical analysis revealed layer after layer of alkaloid traces, building up over decades. But one compound appeared only in the final weeks before death, something that spiked dramatically, something that wasn't there before. Whatever he was taking at the end, it was different. It was more, and we have no idea what it was. When researchers analyze mummified remains of Egyptian priests, they're not just looking at preserved bodies, they're examining chemical archives. Hair grows continuously, incorporating substances present in the bloodstream at the time each strand forms. The result is a chronological record, a timeline of consumption preserved in keratin. Modern forensic techniques can read this timeline, identifying compounds and mapping when they were present. What the hair reveals is systematic use over extended periods. These weren't priests who occasionally participated in ceremonial substance use. The alkaloid traces appear consistently throughout years of growth. Whatever they were consuming, they consumed it regularly. The practice wasn't exceptional ritual. It was sustained discipline. Compounds entering their bodies repeatedly, building up residues that accumulated in tissues over time. Bone analysis adds another dimension. Some priestly remains show density abnormalities, consistent with chronic substance exposure. Certain compounds, when metabolized over long periods, affect how the body deposits and maintains calcium in skeletal tissue. The patterns visible in priestly bones suggest bodies adapted to processing unusual chemistry, not damage from poisoning, but evidence of systems that had adjusted to regular presence of specific substances. Liver and kidney tissue, where preservation allows analysis, tells similar stories. These organs filter and metabolize whatever enters the bloodstream. In priestly mummies, microscopic examination reveals cellular patterns, indicating repeated processing of compounds that normal Egyptian populations wouldn't have encountered. The organs had changed structurally in response to their chemical workload. The most intriguing findings involve the pineal gland. This small endocrine organ, located deep in the brain, held sacred significance for Egyptians. They associated it with spiritual perception and divine connection. Modern analysis of priestly pineal glands reveals unusual calcification patterns, mineral deposits forming in configurations that differ from normal populations. Whether this resulted from substance use or represented natural variation that priests considered spiritually significant remains unclear. Some mummified priests show anomalies in brain tissue preservation itself. Normal mummification produces predictable degradation patterns, but certain priestly remains show preservation characteristics, suggesting unusual brain chemistry at the time of death, as if the tissue had been saturated with substances that affected decomposition processes differently than standard mummification would predict. Gastrointestinal tract analysis occasionally reveals residues that weren't part of embalming procedures. Substances present in the stomach or intestines that must have been consumed shortly before death compounds that don't appear in the external mummification materials. In a few cases, these residues contain alkaloids we can identify. In others, they remain unclassified, organic matter that was clearly ingested, but doesn't match any documented Egyptian substance. The priestly body became testimony. Years of practice left permanent traces, chemical signatures written into hair and bone and organ tissue. These weren't bodies that occasionally encountered unusual substances. They were bodies adapted to sustained chemical practice, transformed over time by what they regularly consumed. The priests used substances to access other realms, retrieve knowledge, and transform their bodies. But all of this served a larger purpose, the maintenance of matter, the cosmic order, and when we understand what was at stake, we understand why the secrecy was absolute. The temple at Karnak has 134 columns in its great hypostyle hall. For centuries, we admired them as architecture. Then acoustic engineers discovered that specific columns create specific resonance patterns, frequencies that interact with altered brain states in predictable ways. The priests didn't build a monument, they built an amplifier. Every Egyptian temple followed the same basic plan, a public forecourt where ordinary Egyptians could gather. Beyond that, progressively restricted courtyards where only certain classes could enter. Then the hypostyle halls, accessible to lower priestly ranks. Deeper still, inner sanctuaries where senior priests performed their mysteries. And finally, the innermost chamber, the naos, where only the high priest ventured, containing the divine image in darkness so complete that torchlight barely penetrated. Egyptologists describe this layout as expressing hierarchical theology, the journey from public space to divine presence, from light to sacred darkness. But when we understand what happened in these spaces, another pattern emerges. Each transition point wasn't just architectural, it was a clearance level. Each space corresponded to specific ritual activities and specific substance exposures. Each level of darkness and enclosure created different atmospheric conditions for different stages of practice. The architectural features suddenly make sense. Narrow passages between chambers wouldn't just restrict physical access. They would concentrate incense smoke, forcing anyone passing through to breathe intensely saturated air. Rooms with alcoves, sized precisely for specific ritual configurations, weren't just decorative. They created zones where practitioners could position themselves relative to smoke sources or acoustic focal points. Chambers with particular dimensions produced resonance patterns that priests in altered states would experience as overwhelming presence, sound becoming almost tactile. The hypostyle hall at Karnak demonstrates this precision. Those 134 columns weren't arranged aesthetically, they create acoustic zones. Stand in certain positions and sound reverberates in ways that induce trance even without substances. Combine that acoustic environment with dense incense, and the space becomes an instrument for consciousness transformation. The priests understood this. They positioned ritual activities in exact locations where architecture amplified chemical and sensory effects. Ceiling heights matter too. Lower ceilings trap smoke at breathing level. Higher ceilings in outer chambers let it dissipate. The progression from high open courtyards to low enclosed sanctuaries wasn't just symbolic descent toward the divine. It was a gradient of substance concentration. Each step inward meant breathing air progressively thicker with compounds designed to alter perception. Even light levels served function beyond symbolism. Darkness affects how the brain processes psychoactive substances. Sensory deprivation amplifies internal experience. The innermost chambers, where high priests encountered deities directly, were spaces of total darkness filled with concentrated smoke. Environments that would overwhelm perception, leaving consciousness with nowhere to anchor except the visions unfolding within. Modern psychedelic research emphasizes set and setting, the crucial role environment plays in shaping altered state experiences. The Egyptians understood this 3,000 years earlier. Their temples weren't buildings where rituals happened. They were precision instruments, each architectural feature calibrated to enhance specific aspects of consciousness transformation. The stone and space and darkness and smoke worked together as a system. The temples held the rituals, but the substances themselves were prepared somewhere more hidden, in laboratory, like spaces that have only recently been recognized for what they were. Room 17 at Edfu was overlooked for decades, a small, unremarkable space with worn inscriptions. Then archaeochemists analyzed residue from its floor. They found concentrated alkaloids at levels, suggesting this wasn't tea storage, it was production. The priests were running something very close to a pharmaceutical laboratory, 3,000 years before modern chemistry was born. The Egyptians called them houses of life, spaces attached to major temples where sacred knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Conventional understanding treated these as libraries or scriptoriums, places where texts were copied and studied. But architectural analysis combined with residue testing reveals something else. Many houses of life contained small, secure chambers with features that only make sense as substance preparation areas. At Edfu and Philae, archaeologists have identified rooms whose characteristics point unmistakably toward chemical work. Stone surfaces show wear patterns, consistent with prolonged grinding and crushing. Ceramic vessels, designed for heating and filtering, remain in storage niches. The floors preserve residue traces that chemical analysis reveals as concentrated plant extracts. Not the trace amounts you'd expect from storage or occasional use, but the heavy accumulation that comes from regular production activities. The spaces were deliberately secured. Single entrances that could be sealed. No windows, walls thick enough to muffle sound and prevent observation from adjacent chambers. These weren't open workshops. They were controlled facilities where access was restricted to practitioners who understood what they were handling. Wall inscriptions provide tantalizing documentation, though deliberately obscured. The recipes exist, carved into stone or written on papyri, found in these preparation chambers, but they re-encoded in symbolic language designed to preserve knowledge for initiated readers while remaining incomprehensible to outsiders. Ingredients appear as poetic epithets rather than botanical names. The tears of Isis doesn't tell us which plant to use. The blood of Ra could mean multiple substances depending on context. Instructions describe processes in terms of divine actions. What Thoth mixed when healing the eye of Horus, rather than straightforward physical manipulations. Even for modern researchers with chemical knowledge and access to residue analysis, these texts remain largely opaque. We can identify some ingredients through archaeological chemistry, matching residues to known plants. We can sometimes reconstruct processes by analyzing what equipment was used and what byproducts remain. But complete recipes stay hidden behind symbolic language that assumes readers already know what the symbols mean. What is clear is that these weren't simple mixing operations. The processes involved multiple stages: extraction, concentration, combination, and in some cases what appears to be chemical transformation. Stone surfaces show staining patterns indicating repeated heating of specific compounds. Ceramic filters contain residues suggesting liquids were purified to remove unwanted materials. The work required precision, specialized equipment, and understanding of how different substances behaved when processed. The priests weren't just gathering plants and burning them. They were actively creating preparations, refining raw materials into concentrated forms, combining ingredients in specific sequences to produce effects that natural substances alone wouldn't achieve. Most temples could produce their own preparations, but the most powerful substances weren't made locally. They came from trade networks that stretched across the known world and perhaps beyond. When Hatshepsut sent ships to Punt, she called it an expedition for incense. But the cargo lists that survived include items that weren't incense, plants described in terms that match no Egyptian species, preparations that travelled in sealed vessels, specifically designed to preserve potency. She wasn't buying air freshener, she was restocking something far more valuable. Egyptian temples didn't rely solely on local materials. The substances priests used came from trade networks that stretched across the known world and possibly beyond. Frankincense arrived from Somalia and southern Arabia. Myrrh travelled the same routes. Exotic woods came up from sub-Saharan Africa. These materials appear repeatedly in temple records. Documented purchases from established suppliers, whose relationships with specific Egyptian complexes lasted generations. But the documented trade represents only what officials recorded openly. Residue analysis reveals compounds that don't match any plant native to Egypt or the Near Eastern regions where Egyptian trade is well documented. Some chemical signatures suggest materials from the Indian subcontinent. plants that grow in environments completely unlike anything Egypt had access to through known routes. Others point towards Central Asian origins, or even further. The presence of these compounds in temple residues proves they reached Egypt somehow, through trade networks we haven't fully mapped. Hatshepsut's famous Punt expedition takes on different significance in this context. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show her ships returning loaded with frankincense trees, meant to be replanted in Egyptian soil, but the accompanying cargo lists mention items that weren't trees, mysterious preparations transported in sealed containers, plants described with terminology that doesn't correspond to any species we can identify. The expedition brought back more than incense. It restocked supplies of substances the temples couldn't produce locally. Trade relationships were specific to individual temples. Not every complex had access to every substance. A temple's practices were shaped partly by theology, but also by what its trade connections could supply. The preparations used at Karnak differed from those at Abydos, not just because different deities required different rituals, but because different temples maintained relationships with different suppliers. Access to rare substances depended on commercial networks as much as religious authority. Some materials were so valuable that temples sent their own personnel to foreign lands to secure them directly. Inscriptions describe priests traveling to source regions, spending months or years establishing relationships with local suppliers, learning which plants grew where and when they could be harvested. These weren't casual purchases through middlemen. They were strategic acquisitions requiring dedicated expertise. The diversity of residues across Egyptian archaeological sites reflects this supply chain reality. Each temple complex shows a distinct chemical signature, not just because different gods required different substances, but because geographic and commercial factors determined what each location could access. A temple without connections to Arabian frankincense suppliers might substitute different resins. A complex with unusual access to sub-Saharan trade routes might use preparations unavailable anywhere else in Egypt. Foreign substances supplemented local production. But there was another category, substances so secret that they never travelled, never traded, never left the inner chambers where they were created. And evidence of these is the strangest of all. The residue at Abydos matched nothing found at Karnak. The preparations at Dendera had no parallel at Memphis. Each major temple complex shows unique chemical signatures, substances that existed nowhere else. The priests weren't practicing one religion with local variations. They were guarding completely different technologies for contacting the gods. When archaeochemists began comparing residue samples across Egyptian sites, they expected consistency. If temples were branches of one religious system, their sacred substances should show similarities. Regional variations, perhaps, but fundamentally the same preparations used for fundamentally the same purposes. What they found instead was distinctness. The chemical profiles from different temple complexes didn't just vary, they were unique. Abydos preserved compounds that appear nowhere else in the Egyptian archaeological record. Not trace variations of known substances, but entirely different preparations. Dendera showed its own signature patterns, alkaloids present in concentrations and combinations found at no other site. Memphis, Thebes, Heliopolis, each major religious center had residues that marked it as chemically distinct from the others. This suggests something unexpected. If substances were kept temple-specific, guarded as proprietary knowledge available only to practitioners initiated at that particular location, then Egyptian religion wasn't the unified system we've assumed. It was a collection of related but distinct traditions, each centered on unique preparations that defined its particular approach to encountering the divine. The priests at Abydos weren't doing the same thing as priests at Karnak using slightly different materials. They were doing fundamentally different things. Textual evidence supports this reading. Later sources mention priests traveling specifically to study at certain temples, seeking initiation into mysteries available nowhere else. These weren't casual visits or administrative transfers. They were deliberate journeys to access knowledge that existed only at the destination. One text describes a priest spending years at Abydos learning what cannot be learned at Memphis, phrasing that suggests not theological nuance but practical difference in what could be experienced. The implications are profound. We speak of Egyptian religion as if it were singular, variations in practice reflecting local custom rather than fundamental difference. But if each major temple guarded substances unavailable elsewhere, then initiation at different sites granted access to genuinely different experiences. A priest might worship Osiris at both Abydos and Memphis, but what he encountered in altered states at each location would have been shaped by different chemistry. The gods themselves might have appeared differently, not because theology varied, but because the substances used to perceive them were different. This makes Egyptian religion far stranger than conventional presentations suggest. Not a monolithic system radiating from a central authority, but a network of distinct mystical technologies, each temple complex developing and protecting preparations that represented accumulated generations of experimentation. The diversity wasn't theological variation around a stable core. It was genuine difference in technique, in substance, in the fundamental tools used to access whatever reality priests believed lay beyond ordinary perception. Each temple had its secrets, but all temples were eventually abandoned. The question that haunts researchers isn't just what the substances were. It is what happened to them when Egyptian religion died. The last priest of Philae died in 537 AD. He was the final link in an unbroken chain stretching back 3,000 years. Everything he knew, the formulas, the techniques, the secrets passed from master to initiate across millennia, died with him. Or so we thought. Then we found what he buried. The decline began centuries before Christianity ended Egyptian temple religion. When Alexander's generals took Egypt after his death, they became pharaohs but brought Greek sensibilities. Ptolemaic rulers patronized temples, maintained their economic support, even built new structures. But they also transformed temple character subtly. Greek philosophy influenced how educated Egyptians understood their own traditions. The mystery cults that flourished under Hellenistic influence weren't quite the same as what had come before. Roman conquest accelerated the erosion. Temples that had operated for millennia as tax-exempt institutions with vast agricultural holdings suddenly faced imperial taxation. The economic foundation that had supported priestly training began crumbling. Maintaining the elaborate networks of specialists, substance preparers, ritual experts, keepers of secret knowledge, required resources that were increasingly unavailable. Archaeological evidence maps this decline in material terms. Temple complexes show reduced activity in their inner chambers. Preparation rooms that had operated continuously for centuries display sudden cessation. No new residue layers after certain dates. No signs of continued substance production. Storage facilities were emptied and never refilled. The physical infrastructure of temple religion was shutting down. The chain of transmission broke most critically. Priestly knowledge wasn't written comprehensively. The texts we have are fragmentary, deliberately obscure, written for readers who already understood fundamentals through oral instruction. When older priests died without fully training successors, entire categories of knowledge vanished. Not just specific recipes or techniques, but the conceptual frameworks that made those techniques intelligible. The loss wasn't just information. It was the ability to understand what the information meant. By the time Christianity became Rome's official religion in the 4th century, the great temples were barely functioning. Imperial edicts, closing pagan sanctuaries, accelerated what economic pressure had already accomplished. The last temples to operate, remote sites like Philae, struggled on through devotion more than institutional support. But the priests who witnessed their tradition dying didn't simply accept it. They believed the old ways would eventually return. Egypt had survived foreign rulers before. Greek and Roman dominion would pass, and when they did, the temples would need to be restored. So the last generations of priests hid what they could. They sealed chambers within temples, burying substances and equipment in places only the initiated would recognize. They buried texts and ritual objects at sites whose significance was encoded in traditions that outsiders could access. They preserved knowledge for a future restoration. That future never came. The last priest of Philae died in 537 AD, and with him the final thread of continuous practice. The substances remained buried, the sealed chambers stayed closed. The knowledge encoded in oral traditions had no one left to receive it. The temples closed, the priests died. But the knowledge didn't simply vanish. It went underground, into traditions that preserved fragments while losing the whole. The Christian monks didn't burn everything. They couldn't. Many of them were the children of priests, raised in temple shadows, so they kept what they could reframe and destroyed what they couldn't. The knowledge that survived was the knowledge that could wear a cross. Everything else went into the flames. When Christianity swept through Egypt, the transformation wasn't simple replacement. The first Egyptian Christians, the Copts, came from the same communities that had staffed the temples. Monks establishing desert monasteries were often former priests, or their descendants, men who had grown up surrounded by the old religion's practices and knowledge. They didn't arrive at Christianity as blank slates. They carried fragments of what they'd learned. The continuities are visible if you know where to look. Monasteries were frequently built on former temple sites, not just convenient real estate, but locations whose significance the founders understood. Christian healing rituals in early Coptic practice echo Egyptian magical procedures with remarkable precision. The gestures, the invocation structure, even some of the materials used show clear derivation from temple traditions. Early Coptic texts contain cryptic references to substances and procedures that make little sense within Christian theology, but align perfectly with what we know of Egyptian practices. But this preservation was selective and deliberately incomplete. Christian authorities understood that certain knowledge was incompatible with their faith. Practices centered on substance, induced altered states, couldn't be reframed as Christian mysticism. They were too explicit, too bodily, too focused on techniques rather than grace. These were targeted specifically. Records were destroyed. Practitioners who refused conversion faced persecution. The theological framework that made these practices meaningful, the Egyptian model of reality, with its layered dimensions and accessible deities, was systematically dismantled. What survived were orphaned fragments. Techniques divorced from explanatory context, recipes that described processes without the training to understand why those processes mattered. A monk might preserve knowledge of which plants combine to produce certain effects, but without the temple framework that explained what those effects were for and how to navigate them safely. The preservation was incomplete by design. Early Christianity in Egypt functioned as a filter. Knowledge that could be reinterpreted through Christian categories was kept, often transformed so thoroughly that its origins became invisible. Healing practices became prayers to saints rather than invocations of gods, but the underlying procedures sometimes remained recognizable. Protective amulets continued to be made using similar materials and inscriptions, but now invoking Christ rather than Horus. Everything that couldn't be Christianized was eliminated. The substances themselves, the preparation techniques, the architectural spaces designed for consciousness transformation, these couldn't be baptized. They were incompatible. So they were destroyed or sealed away or simply abandoned as the knowledge of their use disappeared. But the monks weren't the only inheritors. Another group claimed Egyptian wisdom, and they would carry certain secrets into an entirely different civilization. When the Renaissance scholar Marsilio Fifino translated the Hermetic texts in 1463, he believed he was recovering the wisdom of ancient Egypt. He wasn't wrong, but he was reading a photocopy of a translation of a memory of what the priests actually knew. The secrets had survived, but barely, and the most important parts had been deliberately left out. The Corpus Hermeticum emerged in the early centuries, written in Greek but claiming Egyptian origins. The texts were attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the Thrice Great, a figure the Greeks identified with the Egyptian god Thoth. These writings presented themselves as the preserved wisdom of Egyptian temple priests, passed down through initiated lineages, and finally committed to writing, before the knowledge could vanish entirely. What the texts contain are meditation techniques, instructions for achieving visionary states, and cryptic references to substances and procedures that echo what we've deduced about actual temple practices. But the specifics are obscured. Where Egyptian texts named ingredients through symbolic epithets, comprehensible to the initiated, the Hermetic writings operate at one more level of removal. They describe processes in philosophical terms rather than practical instructions. They reference substances without identifying them. They preserve the framework, but not the content. The tradition traveled through channels that transformed it further. When Islamic scholars encountered Hermetic texts, they recognized them as preserving ancient wisdom worth studying. The writings influenced Islamic alchemy, practitioners who believed they were recovering Egyptian techniques for transformation, both material and spiritual. Sufi mystics found in Hermetic philosophy frameworks for understanding their own visionary experiences. The texts moved from Alexandria to Baghdad, from there to Cordoba and Toledo, accumulating layers of interpretation with each transition. Medieval Europe received Hermeticism through Arabic translations, adding another filter between Renaissance readers and the Egyptian sources. Scholars studied these texts as ancient wisdom, not recognizing how much had been lost or transformed in transmission. When Fafino translated the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin, he was working from Greek manuscripts that were themselves compilations of earlier material, edited and reorganized by copyists who didn't necessarily understand what they were preserving. The Renaissance explosion of interest in Egyptian wisdom was built on these fragmentary transmissions. Scholars believed they were recovering authentic ancient knowledge, and in a sense they were. The Hermetic texts genuinely connect to Egyptian temple traditions. But what survived was atmosphere, philosophical framework, and tantalizing hints rather than actual practical knowledge. The meditation techniques were there, the worldview was preserved, the goal of achieving visionary contact with divine realms was articulated clearly. What was missing were the substances, the precise dosing protocols, the architectural contexts, and the generations of accumulated experience that made those techniques work safely and reliably. The Hermetic texts preserved philosophy. The Coptic Church preserved ritual, but neither preserved what mattered most, the actual substances and the precise techniques for using them. That knowledge seemed lost forever, until archaeology began recovering what no text had preserved. They didn't write it down. They never meant us to know. But molecules are harder to destroy than manuscripts, and in the residue of 3,000-year-old pottery, mass spectrometers are finding answers to questions the priests swore to take to their graves. The revolution in archaeochemistry has fundamentally changed what we can know about Egyptian practices. Where previous generations of scholars had only texts to work with, texts deliberately obscure, texts that assumed readers already understood basics through oral instruction, modern researchers can analyze physical evidence the priests left behind unintentionally, the residues they couldn't clean from vessels, the compounds that soaked into porous stone, the traces preserved in contexts no one expected would survive 3 millennia. Mass spectrometry identifies specific molecular structures from samples measured in micrograms. A single grain of residue contains enough information to determine not just what plant family it came from, but potentially which specific species, what part of the plant was used, and how it was processed. The technique is sensitive enough to detect compounds present in concentrations the human nose couldn't perceive. Isotope analysis adds another dimension. Elements exist in multiple isotopic forms whose ratios vary geographically, depending on local geology and climate. By analyzing isotope signatures in ancient residues, researchers can determine where materials originated, sometimes pinpointing regions with remarkable precision. A substance found at Karnak might reveal isotopic fingerprints, proving it came from the Himalayas, documenting trade networks no text ever mentioned. DNA extraction from degraded botanical remains allows identification even when visual features are destroyed. Plant matter preserved in Egyptian contexts for thousands of years, reduced to unrecognizable powder, can still yield enough genetic material to match against modern reference databases. Species that ancient texts mentioned only through poetic names can be identified definitively. The breakthroughs keep coming. Cannabis residues have been confirmed in Egyptian archaeological contexts, a substance that appears in no official text, never mentioned in surviving records, but present physically in vessels from temple sites. The priests were using it, they just never wrote it down. Kifi formulas have been reconstructed with more completeness than any surviving recipe provides. By analyzing residues from multiple sources and cross-referencing with fragmentary textual instructions, researchers have produced preparations that may closely approximate what ancient priests actually made. Most mysteriously, compounds have been identified that don't match any known substance. Molecular structures that appear in temple residues, but that we can't attribute to any plant, mineral, or animal source in our databases. Either they're degradation products of known substances, transformed by time in ways we haven't characterized, or they represent preparations made from materials we haven't encountered, possibly extinct species, possibly substances from regions whose botany remains incompletely catalogued. But there are limits. Many organic compounds degrade beyond recognition. The most volatile substances, the ones most likely to produce dramatic effects, are also most likely to vanish completely. Many vessels were cleaned before disposal, and the most secret preparations may have been consumed entirely, their containers destroyed, leaving nothing for modern analysis to find. We've recovered much, but the most important substances, the ones reserved for the highest mysteries, remain unexplained, not because we can't find them, but because when we find them, we don't know what they are. The spectrometer returned a molecular formula that should be impossible. A compound with no natural source, no known synthetic pathway, no match in any database on Earth. It wasn't contamination. The dating confirmed ancient origin. It wasn't error. Multiple labs verified the finding. It was simply there, in a vessel from a priest's tomb, waiting 3,000 years to be found. And we have no idea what it is. When archaeochemists analyze ancient residues, they follow established protocols. First, they verify the material is genuinely ancient, not contamination from handling, not modern substances that leached into artifacts during storage. Carbon dating of associated organic matter confirms age. Stratigraphic context confirms the material was sealed at deposition. Once ancient origin is established, identification begins. The process uses multiple analytical methods. Gas chromatography separates compounds. Mass spectrometry determines molecular weights and structures. Nuclear magnetic resonance reveals how atoms are bonded. Results are compared against databases containing millions of known compounds. Every substance science has ever identified and characterized. For most materials, this process produces answers. The compound matches something known, its source becomes clear. But for certain residues from Egyptian priestly contexts, the process fails. The molecular formula doesn't match anything in the databases. The structure is novel, not a variant of known compounds, but genuinely unfamiliar. Researchers expand their searches. Perhaps it is a degradation product, something that was originally a known substance, but transformed chemically over millennia. They synthesize possibilities, artificially aging known compounds to see if any produce the observed structure. Nothing matches. One category involves compounds that appear plant. Derived carbon signatures indicate biological origin, but don't correspond to any plant in botanical records. The molecular structure suggests these were alkaloids or related secondary metabolites that plants produce for defense or signaling. But no Egyptian plant produces them. No plant anywhere that we've catalogued produces them. Either they come from extinct species that vanished before modern botany could document them, or they originate from regions whose flora remains incompletely inventoried. More disturbing are compounds that appear synthetic, not naturally occurring at all, but structured in ways suggesting deliberate manufacture. Organic chemistry recognizes certain molecular arrangements as products of intentional synthesis, bonds that don't form spontaneously, configurations that require specific reaction conditions to create. Some Egyptian residues contain structures displaying these characteristics. A chemist who published findings on temple residues noted in his paper that calling something synthetic requires proving intentional manufacture, impossible to demonstrate conclusively from ancient samples. But he added that the alternative explanations seemed equally implausible. Natural processes that could produce these structures would require conditions that don't exist in any known biological or geological context. Another researcher, after 15 years analyzing unidentified compounds from priestly contexts, wrote that the work had been humbling in ways I didn't anticipate. Each advancement in analytical capability revealed new puzzles rather than resolving old ones. The substances weren't becoming clearer with better technology, they were becoming stranger. The scientific community approaches these findings cautiously. Absence of identification doesn't prove anything extraordinary. Unknown doesn't mean unknowable. Perhaps the plants are simply extinct. Perhaps the synthesis pathways were simpler than we imagine. Perhaps future analysis will reveal mundane explanations. But decades have passed. The compounds remain unidentified. We can detect them, analyze their structures, describe their molecular formulas with precision. We simply cannot explain what they are or where they came from. We don't know what these substances are. But that mystery leads to harder questions. Where did they come from? And how did priests, without modern chemistry, create compounds that we can't reproduce? The papyrus describes a plant called the Silent One. Its preparation granted visions of Osiris himself. Botanists have searched for 150 years. They found nothing, no plant in Egypt, Africa, or the entire world that matches the description. Either the text is fiction, or we're looking for something that no longer exists on Earth. Extinction offers a straightforward explanation for why certain Egyptian substances cannot be identified. Species disappear. This has been happening since life began, and the specific flora of the Nile Valley 3,000 years ago cannot be perfectly reconstructed from what survives today. The plants growing in ancient Egypt were not necessarily the same species we find there now. Egyptian botanical texts mention dozens of plants by names that cannot be matched to any known species. Not vague descriptions that could fit multiple candidates, but detailed accounts of appearance, habitat, harvest timing, and preparation methods that correspond to nothing in modern botanical inventories. Scholars initially assumed these were poetic names for common plants, metaphorical language rather than literal species identification. But as the number of unmatched descriptions accumulated, that explanation became less satisfying. The environment has changed dramatically. The Sahara 3,000 years ago was less severe than today. Ancient climate data shows greater rainfall, more vegetation extending into regions, now completely barren. The Nile's ecology was different before modern damming altered flood patterns and sediment distribution. Species that thrived in ancient conditions may have vanished as those conditions disappeared. Mediterranean trade networks brought plants from distant regions into Egypt. Some may have been cultivated in temple gardens for ritual use. If those cultivation practices ended when temples closed, and if the plants weren't established in wild populations, they would have simply disappeared. The species still exist somewhere, perhaps in remote regions we haven't adequately surveyed, but they're no longer accessible where ancient records described finding them. Fungal species add another dimension. Fungi are notoriously difficult to identify from ancient descriptions, and many produce psychoactive compounds. If priests used specific fungi that have since gone extinct, or that we haven't properly characterized, no amount of chemical analysis would match residues to known sources. The mycological inventory of ancient Egypt is essentially unknown. Modern researchers can barely reconstruct what fungi grow in Egypt today, much less what species existed 3 millennia ago. The extinction hypothesis carries sobering implications. If priests cultivated plants that subsequently disappeared, their substances are literally irreproducible. This isn't secret knowledge that could theoretically be recovered through better scholarship or more complete archives. It is permanently gone. The source material no longer exists anywhere on Earth. Some ancient knowledge may be not just hidden, but lost in the most absolute sense, erased by ecological change, species extinction, and the transformation of landscapes that once supported biodiversity we'll never encounter. But extinction doesn't explain everything. Some unidentified compounds show signs not of natural origin, but of deliberate synthesis, suggesting priests may have created substances through processes we don't understand. The compound shouldn't exist. Its molecular structure requires precise temperature control and specific catalysts to synthesize. Modern chemists can make it with laboratory equipment and a PhD. The residue is 3,000 years old, and we have no idea how it got into an Egyptian jar. Either our dating is wrong, our analysis is wrong, or ancient chemistry was something we don't understand at all. Certain compounds recovered from priestly contexts don't just fail to match known substances, they display molecular structures that shouldn't occur naturally, configurations that require specific reaction conditions to form, bonds that don't spontaneously create themselves through biological processes. When organic chemists examine these structures, they recognize patterns associated with synthesis rather than extraction. The evidence demands careful interpretation. Contamination can create confusing results. Modern substances infiltrating ancient contexts produce exactly the kind of anomalies we're discussing. Degradation over millennia can transform simple compounds into complex ones through pathways we haven't fully characterized. Sample handling, storage conditions, and analytical methods all introduce potential for error. Claiming ancient synthesis based on molecular structure alone would be premature. But the pattern persists across multiple samples from multiple sites, analyzed by multiple laboratories. The compounds appear in sealed contexts where contamination seems unlikely. Dating confirms ancient origin. The structures aren't random. They show consistency, suggesting deliberate rather than accidental formation. Egyptian chemistry was more sophisticated than popular imagination assumes. Metallurgy demonstrates understanding of heat, oxidation, and transformation. Bronze production requires precise temperature control and knowledge of how different metals behave when combined. Gold refining involves chemical processes that separate desired metal from ore. These are not simple crafts. They're complex technologies, requiring generations of accumulated knowledge about how materials transform under specific conditions. Mummification represents even more direct chemical expertise. Natron desiccation, oil preservation, resin application. These processes required understanding cause and effect at a chemical level, even if practitioners didn't articulate it in modern terminology. The embalmers knew which substances preserved tissue, which prevented decay, which created desired physical properties. This knowledge came from systematic experimentation over centuries. The Hermetic tradition's obsession with transformation may reflect actual practice rather than pure philosophy. Texts attributed to Egyptian sources describe processes that later became Western alchemy, transformation of base materials into refined products through carefully controlled procedures. Medieval alchemists believed they were recovering Egyptian knowledge. Perhaps they were correct, just not in the ways they imagined. If priests manufactured substances rather than merely extracting them from plants, the implications cascade outward. It means their preparation chambers were functioning chemical laboratories. It means knowledge transmission included not just recipes but underlying principles, why certain procedures worked, what conditions produced which results. It means Egyptian chemistry achieved sophistication we've systematically underestimated. The evidence doesn't support certainty. We may be misinterpreting degraded compounds, seeing patterns that aren't meaningful, attributing to ancient chemistry what better analysis would reveal as natural processes. But the possibility remains genuine. Some residues show characteristics that challenge everything we assume about the technological limitations of ancient civilizations. Extinction or manufacture, maybe both, might explain our unidentified compounds, but explaining what the substances were doesn't answer the harder question. How did they affect those who consumed them? And the answer to that question may be stranger than any chemical analysis can reveal. Suppose we found the exact recipe tomorrow, every ingredient, every proportion, every step of preparation. We still couldn't know what the priests knew, because the drug wasn't the experience. The drug was the key. The experience was everything else. The training, the belief, the architecture, the darkness, the expectation of meeting gods. We've lost that door, and we can't build it again. Modern psychedelic research has established something crucial. Drug effects aren't purely chemical. The same substance, at the same dose, in the same person produces radically different experiences depending on context. Set matters. Your mental state, expectations, intentions going in. Setting matters. The physical environment, who is present, what sensory inputs surround you. And cultural framework matters most of all. What you believe is possible. What categories you have for interpreting unusual experiences. What meaning you assign to what you perceive. Egyptian priests weren't just consuming substances, they were consuming them after years of training that taught them what to expect and how to navigate what they encountered. They were consuming them in architectural spaces designed to amplify specific effects. Darkness, acoustics, smoke density, all calibrated for maximum impact. They were consuming them within a cosmology that explained visions as encounters with actual realms and actual beings, not hallucinations to be dismissed or analyzed but realities to be engaged. The substances opened doors, but training determined which doors could be seen. Architecture shaped where those doors led. Belief structured what waited on the other side. Remove any element, and the experience transforms entirely. Researchers have attempted reconstructions. Teams have experimented with known substances in settings designed to approximate ancient ritual contexts. They report that environment profoundly shapes experience. The same compound consumed in a clinical setting versus a temple, like space, produces recognizably different effects. Expectation matters even more. Participants primed to expect specific types of visions report them more frequently than those given no framework, but these modern experiments can only approximate. The researchers aren't Egyptian priests. They haven't undergone decades of initiatory training. They don't genuinely believe they're about to encounter Osiris. The temple reconstructions, however careful, are built with modern materials in modern landscapes. The cultural matrix that made priestly experiences meaningful has vanished. Even if we recovered every lost recipe with perfect accuracy, we couldn't simply become ancient practitioners. The substances would affect us differently because we bring different minds, different expectations, different interpretive frameworks. A modern person experiencing visions of Egyptian deities would process those experiences through contemporary psychological categories, archetypes, symbolic meaning, neurochemical effects. An Egyptian priest experiencing the same visions would have understood them as literal encounters with objective beings in actual realms. Neither interpretation is necessarily more valid. They're different frameworks for making sense of genuinely strange experiences. But the difference means we cannot truly replicate what the priests experienced. We can study the tools. We can analyze the substances. We can reconstruct the recipes and the spaces. But we cannot become the people who used those tools within that worldview after that training. But if we can't reconstruct their experience, we can still ask what their practices meant and what they might mean for us, because the questions the priests asked haven't gone away. What happens when we die? Can consciousness exist outside the brain? Is there something beyond ordinary reality? Modern science dismisses these questions as unanswerable or meaningless. The Egyptian priests spent 3,000 years trying to answer them, with systematic experimentation that would look remarkably scientific if we could get past our assumptions about what science is allowed to study. At the core of Egyptian priestly practice were questions that humans have never stopped asking. Not theological questions about which gods to worship or how to perform correct rituals, but fundamental inquiries about the nature of consciousness and reality. Is awareness confined to the physical brain, or can it access dimensions beyond ordinary perception? Is death the end of consciousness, or a transition to another mode of existence? Can human beings contact intelligences fundamentally different from ourselves? Are there technologies, chemical, acoustic, architectural, for reliably expanding awareness beyond its normal boundaries? These weren't abstract philosophical speculations for the priests. They were research questions investigated through systematic methodology. The substances, the architecture, the training protocols, all of it served experimental purposes. The priests were testing hypotheses. They consumed specific compounds under controlled conditions and documented what happened. They varied dosages, combinations, contexts, and observed how results changed. They accumulated knowledge across generations, refining techniques based on outcomes. Modern science has chosen largely to ignore these questions, not because they've been answered, but because they fall outside the boundaries of acceptable inquiry. Consciousness studies exist as a field, but mainstream neuroscience treats consciousness as an epiphenomenon of brain activity, something to be explained away rather than explored in its own right. Questions about whether consciousness might exist independently of physical substrate, whether it might access realms beyond ordinary perception, whether contact with non-human intelligence is possible, these are defined as unscientific before investigation begins. The priests operated with different assumptions. They believed reality was more than what ordinary perception revealed. They believed consciousness could be expanded to perceive more completely. They believed systematic investigation could produce reliable knowledge about these expanded states. And crucially, they were willing to experiment, to consume substances, to subject themselves to intense experiences, to risk the dangers of consciousness transformation in pursuit of answers. In one crucial way, the priests were perhaps more scientific than modern skeptics. Science is supposed to be about following evidence and testing hypotheses empirically. The priests did exactly that. They didn't just theorize about altered states, they created them and observed what happened. They didn't just speculate about life after death. They developed methods they believed allowed contact with the dead and documented those encounters. Whether their conclusions were correct is a separate question from whether their methodology was rigorous. The questions they investigated haven't disappeared. People still want to know what happens after death. We still wonder whether consciousness is more than brain activity. We're still curious whether reality contains dimensions we don't normally perceive. Modern culture has largely severed these questions from systematic investigation, relegating them to personal belief or dismissing them entirely. The priests treated them as knowable through proper methodology. The priests asked the deepest questions, but their methods, their substances, have a complicated legacy, and understanding that legacy requires confronting what has happened since. Johns Hopkins, Imperial College London, UCSF. The most prestigious research institutions in the world are now studying substances that produce states identical to what Egyptian priests described. We call it psychedelic research. They called it entering the duat. Different words for the same door, but they had 3,000 years to learn how to open it safely. We just beginning. The reconnection happened gradually. 19th century anthropologists documented indigenous plant use in shamanic contexts, cataloguing practices that seemed exotic and primitive. Mid-20th century chemists isolated the active compounds, psilocybin from mushrooms, mescaline from cacti, DMT from various plant sources. For a brief period in the 1950s and 60s, legitimate scientific research explored these substances. Researchers reported therapeutic potential for alcoholism, depression, and end-of-life anxiety. Publications appeared in mainstream journals. The work seemed promising, then cultural panic shut it down. Psychedelic substances became associated with counterculture, anti-war movements, and social disruption. Governments classified them as dangerous drugs with no medical value. Research became illegal. For decades, the questions those substances raised were banished from legitimate scientific inquiry. The current renaissance began quietly in the 1990s and accelerated dramatically in the past decade. Research institutions received permission to resume studies. Clinical trials demonstrated effectiveness for treatment, resistant depression, PTSD, addiction, and existential anxiety in terminal patients. Brain imaging revealed how these substances affect neural networks. The work is rigorous, peer-reviewed, and producing results impossible to dismiss. Researchers report experiences from study participants that echo ancient accounts with disturbing precision: encounters with beings, passage through geometric spaces, communication without language, profound conviction of having accessed realms beyond ordinary reality, life-changing insights about death, consciousness, and the nature of self. The phenomenology matches what Egyptian priests described, not just vaguely, but in specific structural details. The field of archaeodelic research has emerged explicitly investigating ancient psychedelic use. Scholars are re-examining archaeological evidence, testing residues, and reinterpreting texts through the lens of psychedelic phenomenology. What seemed like mythology or metaphor suddenly reads as experience reports. The reframing is transforming understanding of ancient religions globally, not just Egypt but Greece, India, pre-Columbian Americas and beyond. But crucial differences separate modern research from ancient practice. Contemporary psychedelic studies are secular, focused on therapeutic outcomes measured by standardized instruments. Sessions occur in clinical settings with medical supervision. The substances are pure compounds administered at known doses. The framework is neuroscience and psychology, not cosmology and theology. Ancient practice operated completely differently. Training lasted years or decades. Practitioners underwent extensive preparation, teaching them what to expect and how to navigate experiences. The cosmological framework wasn't just belief. It was an interpretive structure that made experiences meaningful rather than chaotic. Cultural containers provided integration, connecting individual experiences to collective understanding. Architecture, ritual, and community context shaped outcomes in ways clinical settings cannot replicate. Modern research is reopening doors the priests knew. But it is doing so without the elaborate protocols, the years of training, the cosmological frameworks, and the cultural wisdom that made ancient practice sustainable across millennia. We rediscovering powerful technologies for consciousness transformation, while lacking the instruction manuals. The parallels suggest modern science might benefit from studying ancient methodologies more carefully, not to adopt ancient beliefs wholesale, but to understand what those elaborate training protocols were actually doing and why they might have been necessary. Modern science is reopening doors the priests knew, but it is opening them without the preparation, the protocols, or the wisdom that made ancient practice safe. And the risks are real. We found their warnings in the tombs, curses that promised spiritual destruction to anyone who entered uninitiated. We dismissed them as superstition. Then we found the other bodies, priests who died young, showing chemical signatures of extreme substance exposure. The curses weren't threats, they were documentation. The priests knew exactly how dangerous their practices were, and they weren't exaggerating. The elaborate security systems surrounding priestly substance use weren't arbitrary. The clearance levels, the oaths of secrecy sworn on pain of death, the years of preparation before receiving access to inner chambers. Modern viewers might interpret this as elitism or power hoarding, but the evidence suggests something else. The restrictions reflected genuine understanding of danger. Substances capable of transforming consciousness are also capable of destroying it. The same compounds that expand awareness in prepared individuals can shatter psychological integrity in the unprepared. Ancient texts describe outcomes we'd now recognize as psychotic breaks, practitioners who entered altered states and never fully returned, whose grip on ordinary reality dissolved permanently. The warnings weren't metaphorical, they documented actual casualties. Analysis of certain priestly remains reveals substance exposure patterns that suggest fatal outcomes. Young priests showing extreme chemical signatures in their tissues, dying decades before normal life expectancy, their bodies bearing evidence of consumption that exceeded safe thresholds. These weren't accidents. They were the documented costs of practices pushed too far, too fast, without adequate preparation. Priestly training lasted years or decades before initiates accessed the most powerful substances. That training wasn't just learning rituals or memorizing texts. It was building psychological containers strong enough to hold what the substances would reveal. The experiences these compounds produced were overwhelming. Encounters with what seemed like non-human intelligences, confrontations with death, dissolution of the boundaries that normally define self. Without proper preparation, such experiences didn't enlighten. They destroyed. Modern psychedelic research is rediscovering these lessons through painful experience. Clinical studies document challenging experiences, the sanitized term for what users call bad trips. Some participants emerge from sessions with lasting psychological damage. Others struggle to integrate peak experiences into ordinary life, finding mundane reality unbearably diminished after glimpsing what seemed like ultimate truth. A small but significant percentage develop persistent perceptual distortions or dissociative symptoms. The challenges aren't new. They're what the Egyptian priests spent millennia learning to manage. Their elaborate protocols weren't superstition. They were accumulated wisdom about how to safely navigate territories of consciousness that could heal or harm depending on approach. The years of training taught practitioners to maintain stability while experiencing instability, to hold contradictions without fragmenting, to return from the most extreme states with self intact. The secrecy served protective purposes. Restricting access to only those adequately prepared wasn't elitism but safety protocol. The priests guarded their knowledge because releasing it freely would have created casualties. People consuming powerful substances without the preparation necessary to survive what those substances revealed. The restriction wasn't about hiding treasure, it was about preventing harm. Modern culture tends to dismiss ancient warnings as irrational fear or control mechanisms, but the archaeological evidence suggests the priests weren't exaggerating danger or protecting arbitrary power. They were documenting real risks, learned through real casualties, across generations of practice. The priests protected their secrets because the secrets had power. And the most important question may not be what they knew, but what we should do with what we've recovered. In 1898, Ludwig Kiemer opened a jar that had been sealed for 3 millennia. Inside was a substance we still cannot name. The priests who sealed it believed they were protecting secrets until the world was ready to receive them. Perhaps they were wrong. Perhaps no world will ever be ready. Or perhaps their timing was exactly right, and we only now developing the science to understand what they preserved. The jar is open. The substance is there. The question is no longer what they knew. The question is what we do next. What we've established is remarkable. Egyptian priests systematically used mind, altering substances to access experiences, They considered real contact with divine realms. Not occasionally, not casually, but through elaborate protocols maintained across 3,000 years of continuous practice. We there identified some of those substances: blue lotus, frankincense, cannabis, preparations whose chemistry we can reconstruct. But others remain mysterious. Compounds that don't match any known plant, molecular structures that suggest processes we don't understand, residues that resist every analytical method we possess. The knowledge was nearly lost. When the temples closed, when the last priests died, when Christianity and Islam transformed Egyptian religious landscape, the practices vanished. The substances were hidden. The texts became incomprehensible. For 15 centuries, what the priests knew survived only as fragments in traditions that had forgotten their origins. But physical evidence endures. Modern archaeochemistry is recovering what textual transmission failed to preserve. Mass spectrometry reads molecular signatures from samples smaller than grains of sand. Isotope analysis traces materials to their geographic origins. DNA extraction identifies plants from degraded remains. The priests could destroy the evidence their bodies and vessels preserved, and that evidence is speaking, telling us things no ancient text recorded, revealing practices that were never meant to be documented. What it means remains uncertain. We don't know if priests contacted actual other realms or experienced neurologically generated visions. Both interpretations fit the evidence. We don't know if their lost substances would produce effects we could meaningfully use. The substances were tools within specific cultural contexts. Remove the context, and the tools might serve no purpose. We don't know if their practices could ever be safely recovered. The training protocols, the architectural settings, the cosmological frameworks that made those practices functional may be irreproducible. Ancient humans developed sophisticated technologies for exploring consciousness that modern civilization mostly forgot. We're only beginning to recover what they knew, but recovery isn't restoration. We cannot become Egyptian priests. We can study their tools without fully understanding what they did with them. We can identify their substances without knowing how to use them safely. We can reconstruct their practices without recreating the experiences those practices produced. The temples are silent, the priests are gone, but the substances remain, in museum jars, in laboratory samples, in residues still being extracted from newly discovered tombs. Somewhere in that evidence is knowledge we lost and might recover. The investigation isn't over, it is only beginning.